The bullet was already in the chamber before anyone knew she was a shooter. 640 meters. Blizzard conditions. Crosswind shifting every 3 seconds. 8 men pinned behind frozen rocks, bleeding out in minus 30 degrees. And the enemy sniper on the ridge had already killed 2 of them before anyone even heard the shot. Everyone thought Captain Elena Cross was the medic. Nobody thought to watch her hands. She lay flat against the ice shelf, cheek pressed to the stock of a rifle no one knew she was carrying, and she breathed out slowly. The way people only breathe when killing is something they've done so many times, it stopped feeling like anything at all. The mountain was about to learn what she truly was. If this story grips you from the first line, stay until the end. Drop a like, hit follow, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing Elena Cross noticed about Raven Glacier was the silence underneath the storm. Not quiet. The wind was brutal. A sustained shriek that stripped heat from exposed skin in under 90 seconds and threw snow horizontally hard enough to sting through the thin balaclava pulled across her jaw. But beneath that roar, if you listened the way she had trained herself to listen, there was a different kind of stillness, the kind that settled over high ground when something living was watching from it. She felt it the moment the MH-60 banked hard left and began its descent through the cloud ceiling, dropping into the white void below the ridgeline. She felt it before the skids hit frozen ground, before Sergeant Major Grant Mercer started calling out assignments, before the team checked their weapons and started moving. Something was already watching them. She didn't say anything. She was the medic. Medics didn't brief the Sergeant Major on tactical intuition. Medics taped their fingers, adjusted their trauma kits, and kept their mouths shut until someone needed stitching. So Elena Cross kept her mouth shut, slung her medical ruck over both shoulders, and followed the column into the dark. The mission brief had been clean on paper, the way all disaster briefs look clean before the disaster. 8-man reconnaissance team, call sign Ironfall, had gone off net 12 hours earlier during a surveillance push into the high valley north of Firebase Whitmore. Last confirmed position put them approximately 4 kilometers inside a contested mountain corridor, a stretch of terrain the military had been contesting with an irregular enemy force for the better part of 2 years. The corridor was used as a resupply route. The enemy used it to move weapons and fighters south. Ironfall had been inserted to document traffic patterns, mark cache sites, and extract without contact. Except someone had made contact first. The recovery package assembled at Whitmore was lean. 7 operators from Bravo Element, 2 of them former Ranger instructors, 3 with combat deployments that averaged 6 years apiece, plus Elena, attached as medical personnel per standard protocol for personnel recovery missions. The team lead was Grant Mercer, 14 years in uniform. The last 8 spent doing exactly this kind of work in exactly this kind of terrain. He was 41 years old, built like someone had nailed muscle to a post and let it cure for a decade, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had stopped being surprised by bad news sometime in his mid-30s. He had not been surprised when headquarters assigned Elena to his package. He'd been annoyed, which was different. "What's her background?" he'd asked the operations sergeant, Dill Torres, while they loaded kit onto the bird. Torres had glanced at the manifest. Medic, advanced trauma cert, 2 deployments, 1 Afghanistan, 1 West Africa. Fitness scores are solid. Combat. Torres paused just long enough to mean something. Indirect. Grant had nodded, said nothing, and spent the 20-minute flight thinking about how to keep her alive without getting one of his other people killed managing her. That was the word he'd used in his head. Managing. He remembered it later, after the glacier, with something close to shame. They moved in column, Grant on point, Torres behind him, Elena third from the rear, with Specialist Calvin Osei directly behind her, unofficially assigned as her shadow. Calvin was 26, a good kid, 2 years out of selection, and he had the unfortunate habit of checking on Elena every 4 minutes the way someone checks on a child they've been told not to let out of their sight. The first time he did it, she said nothing. The second time, she stopped walking. "I'm fine," she said. "Didn't say you weren't," Calvin answered. "You keep looking back." Habit. She didn't push it. She adjusted the chest strap on her ruck and kept moving, and Calvin fell back into step behind her, and neither of them said anything else for the next kilometer. The terrain was punishing. Raven Glacier wasn't a single ice sheet the way the name implied. It was a system of interlocking ice formations and compressed snowpack across a high-altitude valley, broken by exposed rock faces, sudden vertical drops, and shallow crevasse networks that weren't always visible from above. The temperature read -27 at departure and had been dropping for 6 hours. Wind chill pushed it down past -40 in the exposed sections between the rock formations. They moved single file, keeping to the rock wherever possible, team members calling terrain changes back through the column. Drop, 6 inches, ice shelf, left side. In the quiet professional shorthand of people who had worked together long enough to not need full sentences. Elena filed the terrain. Every step. Every transition between ice type and rock. Every shadow thrown by every boulder. It was not something she did consciously anymore. It was simply how her brain worked, cataloging the world the way a camera catalogs light, automatic, exhaustive, constant. She noted 3 good overwatch positions before they'd covered the first kilometer. "Asset." Grant called a halt at the base of a narrow granite outcropping, dropped to one knee, and pressed his earpiece in with 2 fingers. "Iron Fall, this is Bravo Actual. Radio check, over." Static. A long stretch of it. He waited 15 seconds, tried again. More static. He turned to Torres without standing. "Last confirmed ping, 4 clicks north-northeast, valley floor." Torres pulled his map, actual paper, because electronics failed in this cold, and traced a route with a gloved finger. Canyon narrows between those 2 ridges. If they're still at last known, we're looking at 40 minutes of movement minimum. 40 with clean terrain, said Oakes, the team's senior breacher from behind Torres. "This isn't clean terrain." "Nothing about this is clean terrain," Grant said, and stood. "Keep moving. Stay tight." Elena had been watching the ridge during the radio check. The North Ridge, specifically. The one that rose in a staggered series of limestone shelves to a height roughly 40 meters above the valley floor. Good position. Commanding line of sight down the entire approach route. Sheltered from the west by a natural rock baffle that would cut most of the crosswind. Exactly where she would have put herself. She looked away before anyone noticed her looking. Awesome. They found the first dead man 22 minutes into the approach. He was face down in the snow, partly covered by drift, visible only because of the dark shape his equipment made against the white. Staff Sergeant Roderick Hall, according to the ID card Torres recovered, while Grant knelt beside him, checking for anything that might explain cause of death. There wasn't much to check. Single entry wound, rear upper left quadrant, exit through the sternum, clean angle, consistent with a shot from elevated ground to the northwest. He didn't even have his weapon up, Oakes said quietly. No one responded to that. Elena crouched beside the body and put her hand on Hall's shoulder briefly, not a clinical gesture, just a human one, and then stood and said, "Time of death is somewhere between 6 and 10 hours ago based on freeze progression. He wasn't moving when he was hit." Grant looked at her. "He was sitting," she said, weight distribution in the impression underneath him. "He sat down here, maybe to wait, maybe because he was already hit somewhere else and couldn't keep moving. Then whoever was on that ridge found him." Silence. "You read a lot?" Calvin asked. He meant it as a genuine question, not a jab. "Some," Elena said. Grant studied her for another second without expression, then stood. "We leave him. Can't carry him and fight if we have to fight. Torres marked the position, we recover him on the way out." He looked around the column. "Eyes up. We know there's a shooter with high ground. Move fast, stay low, use the rock. Questions?" Nobody had questions. They moved. The second body was 400 meters farther north. The third was another 200 meters beyond that. By the time they found the third, everyone knew what kind of operation this had become. "Execution," Oakes said flatly. "Ambush," Torres corrected. "Someone knew they were coming. Is there a difference right now?" Grant cut the argument with a hand signal, and they all went quiet, pressing into the shadow of a rock face while he reassessed. 3 dead from Iron Fall's 8-man team, 5 still unaccounted for, which meant 5 alive or 5 scattered across the next few kilometers of glacier that Elena was already measuring in her head as potential kill zones. She ran the math without meaning to. Elevation, angle, wind, the consistent wound pattern across the 3 bodies, all shots from the northwest ridge, all clean through and throughs, no ragged entry or tumbled exit to suggest unstable projectile or long barrel drop. Someone up there knew exactly what they were doing. Range discipline, wind compensation, No wasted shots. This wasn't a good shooter. This was an excellent one. We need to move differently, she said. Grant turned. Oakes turned faster. Medic's got a tactical opinion, he said, and his voice wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't kind either. The shooter's northwest, Elena said. She didn't acknowledge Oakes. All three bodies took rounds from that direction. The ridge line has a natural break at about 11 o'clock from our current position, one spot where the rock baffle fails and the wind comes through clean. That's where the shots came from. If we cross the open section between here and the canyon mouth without changing our approach vector, we give them the same angle they used on Ironfall. Grant stared at her. I'm just saying we should use the east side of the boulders, she finished. A long pause. She's not wrong about the angle, Torres said, without looking up from his map. I know she's not, Grant said. He looked at Elena for another moment. Something shifted in his expression that wasn't quite readable, and then said, East side. Move. They moved east side. No one said anything else about it, but Calvin looked at Elena differently after that, and she noticed, and she didn't want to be noticed. Oh. The 5 survivors of Ironfall were found in a natural depression behind a cluster of granite boulders at the narrow end of the canyon mouth, exactly where the terrain map had suggested someone would go if they needed cover from elevated fire and had limited options. They were alive. 3 were wounded. Sergeant First Class Bo Ikeda, the team's senior NCO, had a through-and-through in the left shoulder and had packed it himself using materials from his own kit. He was pale and breathing shallowly but standing, which Elena categorized as deliberately prioritizing appearance over comfort because he didn't want his people seeing him sit down. Private First Class Amara Wells had a fragment wound along her right thigh, grenade proximity, given the pattern, that had been wrapped but not properly sealed. She was sitting with her back against the granite and her rifle across her lap, and she looked at the arrival of Grant's team with the particular expression Elena recognized from every hard environment she'd ever worked in. The expression that said, "You actually came." The third casualty was Specialist Luis Garza, who was unconscious, his left arm splinted with 2 tent stakes and paracord. Head wound, superficial but bleeding steadily through a rough dressing. Elena moved to Garza first, automatic and immediate, dropping beside him before Grant had finished his initial debrief with Ikeda. He's been out about 2 hours, Ikeda told her. Hit his head on the rock when the second grenade went off. We couldn't keep him conscious. Pupils? Elena asked, already checking them herself with her penlight. Left was larger than right last time I looked. Still is. She moved quickly and methodically, checking Garza's airway, his breathing rate, pressing her fingers along his skull without gloves despite the cold because she needed the sensitivity. She found the specific point of impact, a depression above and behind his left ear, not deep enough to indicate skull fracture, but significant enough to watch carefully. He needs to be moved. The longer we're stationary out here, the worse his prognosis gets. Working on it, Grant said, without looking at her. She bit back what she actually wanted to say and kept working. While she ran through Garza's secondary assessment and started a proper seal on Wells's thigh wound, she listened to the debrief happening 4 feet away. Ikeda's account was methodical and grim. Ironfall had been on their 3rd night of observation when they detected movement, a large element, professionally organized, moving through the valley with far too much coordination for the irregular forces the team had expected to find. Ikeda had immediately ordered the team to collapse their position and begin extraction, but someone had triggered a sensor they hadn't known was there. Within 90 seconds, they'd been taking fire from the ridge. Not normal fire, Ikeda said. His voice was flat, professional, the voice of someone giving a report and not a testimony. First 2 rounds took out my point man and my radio man. Clean shots, both of them, rapid succession. Whoever was up there was running a precision hold, not area suppression. Single shooter? Grant asked. Felt like it. Pattern was too consistent for multiple. 1 barrel. 1 very good barrel, Oakes muttered. 1 excellent barrel, Ikeda corrected quietly. Elena kept working on Wells's leg and said nothing. The radio was dead. Torres had been working on the satellite relay system for 12 minutes, swapping batteries, checking connections, running through every procedure in his troubleshooting checklist, and coming up with nothing each time. Jammed, he finally said. Not broken, jammed. Active interference. From what? Calvin asked. From something a lot more sophisticated than what goat herders carry. Torres looked at Grant. Someone out here has electronic warfare capability. The weight of that landed on the group and stayed there. Grant stood in the center of the depression and ran the math out loud. We're 4 clicks from extract. Garza can't walk. Wells can move, but she's slow. We have a precision shooter with unknown position on the northwest ridge, an enemy element of unknown size that has EW capability, and no comms to call for support or push our status. He looked at each person in turn. Options. Wait for the window to close, Oakes said. Storm's supposed to weaken in 6 hours. Storm's getting worse, Elena said. Everyone looked at her again. I watched it coming in during the flight, she said, not apologetically. The cloud base dropped 40 meters in the 20 minutes before we landed. It's not weakening, it's building. If we wait 6 hours, we won't be walking out of here. We'll be a stationary target in a deteriorating environment with a wounded man who needs a neurosurgeon. Silence. She's right, Akita said, with the tired authority of someone who had nothing left to spend on pretense. Grant looked at Elena with that expression again, that not quite readable assessment, and she understood with the cold precision she understood most things that he was revising something. Not his opinion of her, something more specific than that. He was revising his model of what she was. She looked away before he could figure out what to do with that. We move, Grant said. Now, Justin. They moved. Garza was lashed to an improvised stretcher built from 2 rifles and a cut-down sleeping bag, carried by Oakes and a man named Dresner, who hadn't spoken since they arrived at the depression. Wells walked with Calvin's hand under her right arm, refusing more assistance than that. Elena moved between the 2 casualty points, monitoring both while also watching the northwest ridge with the specific unfocused scan she had trained herself to use, not staring at one point, but letting her peripheral vision catch movement the way it was designed to do. The ridge showed nothing, which told her everything. A shooter who had already demonstrated professional-level skill hadn't fired during the recovery link-up, hadn't fired during the 15-minute debrief, was apparently allowing them to begin their extraction movement without interference. That was a choice. You didn't choose to let a target move unless you had a reason. You let them move because movement served your purpose better than stopping them did. You let them move because you had something prepared in the direction they were moving. She ran the terrain ahead in her mind. 4 kilometers to the extraction LZ. 2 of those kilometers crossed open ground. One section, approximately 600 meters in length, crossed a completely exposed ice shelf with no cover on either side. The kind of terrain a precision shooter loved, because targets crossing open ground moved predictably and slowly and had nowhere to go. She almost said something. Then the wind shifted and she heard it, a sound underneath the storm that didn't belong to the storm. Low, mechanical, brief. She grabbed Calvin's arm. Stop, she said. He stopped. Wells stopped. The ripple effect moved up the column and Grant turned. What? He said. She held up one finger, wait, and closed her eyes, which she knew looked strange and didn't care. She was listening for the sound again. The not storm sound. It came again, a faint metallic click, half swallowed by wind. There's someone directly ahead of us, she said, between us and the open shelf. They're set up and waiting. You heard that from 100 meters in this wind, Oakes said. He wasn't asking a question. He was making a statement about how impossible it was. 50 meters, Elena said. Maybe less. Grant stared at her. You can test it if you want, she said calmly. Walk another 20 meters on this route and see what happens. A long pause. Snowflakes hammered against everyone's gear. Garza made a small sound on the stretcher. Grant looked at Torres. Torres had nothing. Grant looked at Akita, who shrugged one functioning shoulder. Alternative route, Grant said. Northeast. Follow the rock formation. It bends around the west face and rejoins the valley floor 300 meters south of the open shelf. You know this terrain? I studied the map. We all studied the map. I study maps differently, she said, and left it at that. Another silence. Then Grant said, Northeast. Single file. Move quiet. They moved northeast. 40 seconds later, A tripwire-activated charge detonated on the route they'd abandoned. The explosion was muffled by the snow, throwing a column of white 20 meters into the air before the wind tore it apart. The concussion hit them like a flat hand against the chest, staggering the column, sending Wells to her knee and rattling the poles of Garza's stretcher. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Calvin said softly, "How did you—" "Doesn't matter," Elena said. She was already moving, checking Wells for secondary injury, running her hands along Garza's neck while he stirred on the stretcher, cataloging the team's status with the rapid triage efficiency of someone who had done this so many times the steps ran without conscious instruction. She felt Grant watching her. She didn't look at him. The northeast route added 600 meters to the approach, but kept them in rock cover for most of it, and they moved without incident until they reached the transition point where the rock face gave way to the open valley floor with the extraction LZ 3 kilometers north across terrain that was now, as Elena had calculated, increasingly compromised. Grant called another halt and brought the team into a tight circle. "We're not making the primary LZ without crossing open ground," he said. "They've got it covered. We've confirmed that." "Alternate extract?" Torres asked. "Secondary LZ is another 2 clicks east. Requires us to cross a saddle at 2,800 meters elevation in zero visibility conditions." "Garza won't survive that altitude gain," Elena said, simply and without apology. Grant knew it too. "Which means we clear the primary route." "Meaning we clear the shooter," Oakes said. "Which means someone has to go up the ridge." The word up sat in the middle of the circle like a dropped grenade. Oakes could go. He was a good climber, solid in mountain terrain. But Oakes's role was breach and close quarters work. The precision shooting required to neutralize an expert sniper at range was a different skill set, and everyone in the circle knew it. Torres could not go. He was managing Garza's stretcher with Dresner and was the only one who understood the relay system well enough to restore comms if the jamming ever broke. Calvin was good, but he was young, and this wasn't a young person's problem. Elena looked at the ridge, 600 meters to the first shelf, 40 degrees of elevation at the steepest section. Wind from the west at approximately 30 kilometers per hour, with gusts that would spike unpredictably. Temperature dropping, visibility measured in meters. She ran the shot in her head the way she always did when she saw a problem. Automatic, involuntary, thorough. She found the solution in approximately 4 seconds. Then she looked back at the circle and found Grant watching her with something that had moved past suspicion into something sharper. "You're not going up there," he said. It wasn't a question. "Who else knows this mountain?" she asked. "I don't need you knowing the mountain. I need you keeping Garza and Wells alive for the next 90 minutes until we find another solution." "There isn't another solution. You've said it yourself." "Then we find a third one." "Grant!" She said it flat, his first name, which she hadn't used before. He noticed. "Someone has to go up there and solve the problem on that ridge. If they don't, we cross the open shelf and we lose people. You know this. I know this. Everyone in this circle knows this." She paused. "I can go." "You're a medic." "I'm a medic right now," she said. And she did not look away from him, and she did not explain what she meant, and the way she said it, right now, left a space around those 2 words that felt heavier than the silence that followed them. Grant stared at her. Oakes stared at her. Calvin stared at her, and his face did something complicated. Boikeda, leaning against a rock with one functional shoulder and the other wrapped against his chest, said quietly, "Let her tell you what she can do, Mercer. You've been wrong about her twice already tonight." Grant's jaw tightened. "Twice?" Oakes said. "The angle," Ikeda said. "And the tripwire." He looked at Elena. "How many times have you done something like this before?" A long pause. The wind screamed down from the ridge and filled the silence with something that wasn't quite an answer. Elena reached up and unzipped the top compartment of her medical ruck. Not the compartment where the trauma supplies were. The other one. The one below it, behind the false partition she had installed herself 3 years ago when she first built this specific configuration. The compartment that was invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. She didn't remove anything yet. She just looked at Grant. "Tell me what you need," she said, "and I'll tell you if I can do it." Grant looked at the compartment. He looked at her hand on the zipper. He looked at her face, which gave him nothing. No fear, no bravado, no performance. Just the flat, patient stillness of someone waiting for a decision they had already made. He looked at the ridge, 600 meters of blizzard and darkness, and somewhere up there a shooter who had killed 3 of his people before breakfast. "I need the northwest ridge cleared," he said. "Single shooter, unknown exact position. No friendly call for fire, no aviation support, no overwatch. One shot is probably all you get before they relocate." "Understood." "If you miss, I won't miss." "If you miss," he said again, harder, "we lose the initiative and we're back in the same situation with less time and less cover and a man whose head is getting worse by the hour." "I know." He stared at her for a long time. "What's in the compartment?" he finally asked. She unzipped it. The components lay nested in their cut foam with the kind of deliberate organization that comes from years of packing the same things in the same order so that your hands could find them in total darkness. The upper receiver. The lower. The folded stock. The barrel, suppressed and already threaded. The turret-adjustable scope in its padded sleeve. The Harris-style bipod, folded flat. It was not a factory rifle. It had never been a factory anything. Grant stared at it. Oakes made a sound that was almost a word. Calvin said nothing at all. "I'll be back in 90 minutes, Elena said. "Keep Garza warm. Check his pupils every 15 minutes. If the left gets significantly larger than the right, pack the wound site behind his ear with gauze and keep his head perfectly still. Wells needs the dressing on her thigh changed in 45 minutes. There's a foil thermal blanket in the left outer pocket of my ruck. Give it to Akita. He's losing core temp faster than he's showing." She looked at each of them in turn. "Questions?" No one had questions. She began assembling the rifle. Her hands moved with the particular fluid certainty of something that had been done so many thousands of times it had burned itself into muscle and nerve and bone. Upper to lower. Barrel seated and torqued. Stock extended and locked. Scope mounted and capped. Bipod attached. 47 seconds from first component to complete system. No one spoke during those 47 seconds. She taught. When she racked the bolt and chambered around, the mechanical sound of it cut through the wind clean and precise and final, and Grant Mercer felt something shift in his understanding of the evening that he suspected would not shift back. "One shot," she said, standing. "One shot," he confirmed. She looked at the ridge one more time, running the math. Wind, elevation, temperature, the specific way the storm was pushing from the west, and how that would affect around at 580, 600 meters. She ran the correction without looking at her turrets, then looked at them anyway and made 2 small adjustments. She pulled the balaclava up over her nose. "Don't cross the open shelf until you see the signal," she said. "What's the signal?" Calvin asked. "You'll know." She moved north, low and fast, using the same rock cover that had hidden them from the tripwire element, and within 60 seconds the storm had swallowed her completely, and the column was alone again with the wind and the dark and the sound of Garza breathing shallowly on his stretcher. Grant stood at the edge of the rock cover and looked up at the northwest ridge for a long time. Oakes moved next to him. "Who the hell is she?" he said, quietly enough that it was a genuine question rather than a challenge. Grant didn't answer. He was asking himself the same thing. 41 minutes passed. They were the slowest 41 minutes of Calvin Osei's 26 years. He spent them watching Garza, checking the dressing, watching the ridge, checking Wells's dressing, watching the ridge again. Torres kept working the radio in short intervals, trying to find a gap in the jamming. Dresner cleaned his weapon in silence, which was the only way Dresner processed anything. Ikeda had accepted the thermal blanket without comment, which told Elena had been right about his temperature drop. Nobody talked much. Nobody looked at Elena's empty spot in the formation without feeling something difficult. At minute 39, the jamming broke. Torres had the relay up in 4 minutes, a personal record under field conditions, driven by the particular urgency of 4 minutes potentially making the difference between having air support and not having it. "Bravo Actual. This is Whitmore TOC. Authenticate Victor Sierra 49er," Grant said immediately. "We have 5 Iron Fall survivors, 3 casualties, including 1 urgent surgical. Primary LZ is compromised. Request immediate QRF and aviation support. Grid follows. He gave the grid. The operations center on the other end was already spinning up by the time he finished. ETA for a gun wing was 22 minutes. Medevac behind that, 22 minutes. He looked at the ridge. He did the math. He keyed his radio. Elena, if you have comms... Static. She was too far. The ridge was blocking line of sight transmission. He lowered the radio. Sir, Calvin said quietly. Grant turned. Calvin was pointing at the northwest ridge. And on the ridge, against the white and gray and black of the storm, a single bright flash, a pen light, long, short, long, mice, blinked 3 times through the blizzard. I'm in position. Grant released a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Stand by, he told the team. She's set. No one asked how he knew. The ridge shelf was 22 centimeters of flat limestone behind a natural parapet of rock, and Elena Cross lay flat across it with the rifle extended and her heart rate at 51 beats per minute, which was 9 beats slower than resting. She had found the enemy shooter in 11 minutes. He was good. He'd chosen a position with 3 angles of egress, a natural hood over his barrel that broke the muzzle signature, and a snow shelter that reduced his thermal profile to almost nothing. From the valley floor, even with optics, he would have been invisible. From the position she'd found, which was technically above his position by 14 meters, and required a traverse across a rock face that she'd had to climb without gloves for the last 4 meters to maintain grip, she had a clear sight line to the back of his hide. He didn't know she was there. He was watching the valley below, waiting for the column to cross the open shelf. She had been watching him for 23 minutes. In those 23 minutes, she had learned his rhythm, the small shift of his weight every 4 minutes, the way he adjusted his position after each wind gust, the rate at which his rifle barrel moved, infinitesimally, involuntarily, as his breath moved his chest. She had found the specific moment in his breathing cycle when everything stopped. She had set her scope for 612 meters, adjusted 3 clicks right for the crosswind, and calculated the temperature effect on her chosen load. She had made the shot in her head 7 times. She made it an 8th time, then stopped making it and waited. Below her, she could see the distant shapes of the column at the rock face, small, vulnerable. 8 people, 5 of them already hurt, waiting on her. The enemy shooter shifted his weight, settled, raised his scope. He'd seen movement in the valley. The column was about to cross. Now! Elena stopped breathing. She stopped being anyone. She was only the mathematics of the shot, the wind, the range, the degree of hold, the specific muscle memory of 500,000 rounds across a career that had never officially existed. Her finger took the last fraction of pressure off the trigger guard, moved to the trigger itself. The storm screamed. The enemy shooter began tracking his target. Elena Cross pressed the trigger. The report was swallowed by the wind before it reached the valley floor. In the column, they heard nothing. What they saw was the enemy shooter's position, which they hadn't known existed until that precise moment, suddenly go still. Not still in the way of someone waiting, still in the way of something switched off. Then the penlight flashed again from the upper ridge. Long, short, long, long. Cross. Clear. Grant stood upright from behind the rock. Move, he said. Now, fast. Cross the shelf before anything else changes. They moved. They were halfway across the open shelf when the sky split open from the northeast, and the gunwing came in low and loud and beautiful, its search beam cutting through the storm like a blade. Garza made a sound that might have been his name for something he'd stopped believing in. Wells laughed, which turned into a cough, which turned into more laughing. Calvin looked up in the helicopter with his rifle hanging loose at his side and did not try to look like he wasn't feeling exactly what he was feeling. Grant keyed his radio. Bravo actual to aircraft, we have a surgical on the ground and 5 walking casualties. We're on the shelf, lighting now. He pulled a chem light, cracked it orange, held it above his head. Do you see us? Bravo actual, we have your orange. Turning to your position. Medevac is 4 minutes behind us. Copy. Grant looked back across the shelf toward the ridge. We have 1 more personnel coming off the high ground. We do not leave until she's aboard. Understood. Holding. The gunwing circled, and the world was loud and cold and bright and alive with the strange grace that only comes when something that was going to go terribly wrong doesn't. And Grant Mercer stood in the center of the open shelf and watched the northwest ridge and waited. She came off the ridge 11 minutes later. No fanfare, no urgency. She appeared at the base of the rock face, moved across the remaining distance to the shelf at a pace that was efficient without being rushed. The rifle broken down and back in its compartment. The medical ruck resettled across both shoulders. She was limping slightly on her left side. Not badly, but there. Calvin went to her immediately because he was 26 and couldn't help himself. "You're hurt. Rock edge on the traverse," she said. "It's nothing." "Let me look." "Calvin?" She stopped him with a hand on his arm. "I promise it's nothing. Check on Wells." He wanted to argue. He didn't. He went to Wells. Elena walked the remaining distance to where Grant was standing and stopped in front of him. He looked at her for a long moment. The helicopter noise made conversation difficult, which he suspected she was fine with. "One shot," he said. "One shot," she confirmed. He nodded slowly. "Medic," he said, and it came out differently than the first time he'd used the word. Quieter. With something underneath it that wasn't quite an apology because Grant Mercer didn't really do apologies, but that carried most of the same weight. She looked at him without expression. Then she walked past him toward the medevac that was setting down 30 meters north, because Garza needed to be loaded first and Wells needed help boarding, and there was still work to do, there was always still work to do, and whatever was underneath Grant's quiet single word was something she could hear later. If there was a later. The storm closed back in around the extraction zone like a curtain falling at the end of the first act. The medevac lifted. And deep in the valley below the northwest ridge, in the position Elena Cross had found and left and never spoken about, the enemy shooter lay still in the snow. And somewhere in the wilderness of his equipment, a radio crackled to life with a voice that spoke in a language no one from Whitmore had ever expected to hear in this corridor. The voice said 3 words. "She's still alive." The 3 words came through the dead man's radio at 0347 hours, and no one at Firebase Whitmore heard them. The signal had been encrypted on a frequency outside the standard monitoring bands, a tight burst transmission lasting less than 2 seconds before it dissolved back into the static of the storm. The equipment required to detect it, let alone decode it, wasn't something a forward operating base in a mountain corridor kept on the shelf. It was the kind of signal that required someone to be specifically looking for it. Someone, somewhere, had been looking. The medevac carrying Garza and Wells touched down at Whitmore's medical pad at 0412 hours. The gunwing peeled off north to resume its patrol arc. Grant's element came in on the follow-on bird 8 minutes later, dirty and cold and hollow in the particular way of people who had just spent several hours being very close to dying and were now required to function like normal humans in a lighted room. The debrief started at 0500 hours. It lasted 4 hours. The operations center at Whitmore was a prefabricated structure bolted to the mountain in sections, with walls thin enough that you could hear the wind working at the seams, and heating units that ran constantly and made a sound like a large animal breathing. It smelled of coffee and wet gear and the particular institutional odor of too many people in too small a space for too long. Major Dennis Falk ran the debrief. He was the senior intelligence officer at Whitmore, a lean man in his late 40s with the careful, slightly distant manner of someone who processed information faster than conversation allowed and found the gap frustrating. He had a notepad in front of him and a recording device running and a cup of coffee that he touched frequently but never actually drank. Grant sat across the table from him and gave the account straight through, from insertion to extraction, without editorializing. Oakes sat to his left, Torres to his right. The surviving members of Ironfall were in the medical section. Akita had been cleared for debriefing but had been asked to wait his turn. Elena was not in the room. The base physician, a Captain Rourke, had flagged her as needing evaluation based on the limping that 3 separate people had reported, and she had been redirected to the medical bay before the debrief began. Grant had noted her absence when the debrief started and said nothing about it. He covered everything else first. The approach, the bodies, the ridge, the tripwire element, the jamming. When he got to the open shelf in the shot, Falk stopped writing. "Say that again," he said. "Single round from the northwest ridge," Grant said. "Neutralize the enemy overwatch position. enabled the column to cross to the extraction LZ. Who made the shot? Captain Cross. A pause. The medic, Falk said. Yes. Falk set his pen down. He looked at Grant with the specific expression of someone who has heard something that doesn't fit the file they're holding. Captain Cross's personnel record shows advanced medical training, field trauma certification, 2 combat deployments. There is nothing in her record indicating power. I know what's in her record, Grant said. Then you understand why I'm asking. I understand why you're asking. I don't have an answer for you. Falk looked at Oakes. 600 meters, Oakes said quietly. Blizzard conditions. She was up the ridge for 41 minutes and came back with the position cleared. I watched her assemble the rifle. It was not a field improvised weapon, Major. It was a precision instrument, custom, suppressed. Falk absorbed this without expression. He picked up his pen. Describe the rifle. Oakes described it. Falk wrote it down. Grant watched Falk write it down and felt the machinery of something larger beginning to move, the way you feel a current change direction in water before you can see what caused it. Was Captain Cross aware that you'd be debriefing this? Falk asked. She's a soldier, Grant said. She understands how debrief works. That's not what I asked. Grant looked at him steadily. I don't know what she was aware of. Falk nodded, wrote something else, and moved the conversation on. But he moved it on in the specific way of someone setting a topic aside rather than closing it, and Grant recognized the difference. Elena had a hairline fracture in her left fibula. She found this out from Captain Rourke, who delivered the information with clinical directness and the mild expression of someone who had seen plenty of people come off mountains in worse shape. The fracture was at the distal end, low enough that Rourke was comfortable with conservative management. A rigid boot, weight is tolerated, no high-altitude climbing for 6 to 8 weeks. Elena sat on the exam table in the medical bay and looked at the boot Rourke set beside her and said, I need to be at the debrief. You need the bone to heal. I've walked on worse. I'm sure you have, Rourke said without judgment, but walking on a fracture in a clinical setting and walking on one in mountain terrain are different conversations. The fracture is stable now. You hit it wrong twice more and it becomes unstable. Elena looked at the boot. Someone will brief you, Rourke said, and left her alone. She sat there for a moment in the particular silence of medical bays, that enforced quiet that pressed on people who were used to noise and movement. She looked at the boot. She looked at the wall. She thought about the radio crackling to life in the snow. She's still alive. She had found the enemy shooter's radio in the 14 seconds she'd spent at his position after the shot. She had heard the transmission begin. She hadn't had time to identify the sender, and the burst encryption had cut the signal before she could extract anything useful from the audio alone. She had memorized the frequency notation from the display, and then left the position the way she always left positions, as if she had never been there. But she had heard the words, 3 of them, and the question of who had sent them and why they mattered sat in the back of her mind now, with the cold, patient weight of something that wasn't going to go away simply because she chose not to look at it. She put the boot on. She stood up, tested her weight, made a clinical note to herself about the pain level, manageable, which was her threshold for operational, and walked to the debrief. She arrived 40 minutes before the session ended. Falk looked up when she came through the door. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes sharpened the way things sharpen when you've been waiting for a variable to appear. Captain Cross, he said, please sit down. She sat. She looked at Grant across the table, who looked back at her without expression. She looked at Oakes, who looked at the table. She looked at Torres, who gave her a brief nod that was more than it appeared. We've been covering the engagement on the ridge, Falk said. I'd like to hear your account. She gave it. Clean and sequential, the way she gave all accounts. Approach, observation period, confirmation of target, correction, fire, extraction. She used the precise technical language of someone who had written more range reports than she could count and had long since stripped her verbal reporting of everything unnecessary. Falk wrote steadily. When she finished, he looked at her over his notepad. Captain, your personnel file doesn't reflect training consistent with the engagement you've just described. No, she said. Can you explain that discrepancy? Not in a standard debrief format. A pause. Falk set his pen down again. What format would you require? Cleared personnel only. SCL compartmented. The room got quieter, which was notable given that it had already been fairly quiet. Grant looked at her with an expression that she couldn't fully parse. It was somewhere between the one he'd worn on the glacier when she'd warned him about the ridge angle and the one he'd worn when she'd opened the compartment in her ruck. A look of someone rapidly reconstructing a picture they'd thought they understood. Oakes said, SCI. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man placing a fact into a category and not particularly liking which category it belonged in. Falk studied Elena for a measured moment. I'm SCI cleared, he said. I know, she said. Most of the people in this room aren't. Another silence. Falk looked at Grant. Grant looked at Elena. Elena looked at Falk. We'll schedule a separate session, Falk said, carefully neutral. In the meantime, you're confined to base pending a full medical clearance. Understood. And Captain, he paused, the rifle. What about it? I'll need it for review. A beat. Of course, she said. She said it simply, without resistance or resentment, the way you agreed to something that was procedurally inevitable and tactically meaningless because the rifle was just an object, and objects could be replaced, and what she actually needed to protect was something Falk couldn't put in a box and label. She left the debrief and went back to the medical bay. She sat on the exam table and looked at the wall and thought about the frequency notation she had memorized, and about the voice on the dead man's radio, and about whether 3 words were enough to start running. The base at Whitmore had a rhythm that felt slower than its reality. People moved with the deliberate economy of those accustomed to cold and altitude and the particular fatigue of sustained operations, not lazy, but calibrated. The dining facility ran 3 hot meals a day. The operations center ran 24 hours. The gym was a converted storage room with equipment that had been flown in piece by piece over 2 years and didn't quite match. Elena found the gym at 06:30, an hour after the debrief released. She couldn't run. The boot made running inadvisable, and her fibula made it actively unpleasant. But she could move, and movement was how she processed things that wouldn't process any other way. So she found a bench and started working through the upper body sequence she'd been using since her early 20s, the one she'd developed in the years when processing things had been a survival skill rather than a preference. She was on her 4th set when Calvin Osei appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, reading the room, her, the empty gym, the early hour, and then came in without asking if she wanted company because he was perceptive enough to know she'd say no. He sat on a weight bench 6 feet away and started lacing his workout shoes. She kept moving. How's the leg? He asked. Fine. Rourke said fracture. Hairline. It's fine. He nodded, tightened a lace. I'm sorry I kept checking on you, he said. On the glacier, every 4 minutes like you were going to wander off. She stopped moving. She looked at him. He was looking at his shoes. His voice had the specific flatness of genuine apology rather than performed apology. No inflation, no justification attached. It's all right, she said. It's not, actually. You'd been right about everything from the first ridge angle, and I kept treating you like you needed supervision. He paused. That was a bad call on my part. She picked up her water bottle and drank from it and said, You were doing your job. I was doing Mercer's assignment, keeping an eye on the medic. He finally looked at her. I didn't think you were actually the person keeping an eye on all of us. A long silence. The heating unit in the corner worked its steady mechanical breath. Where are you from? She asked, because it seemed like the right kind of deflection. Accra, originally. Grew up in Atlanta. He paused. You? Everywhere, she said, which was the honest answer and also the one that ended that line of conversation, as she intended. He took it without pushing. They were quiet for a while. Her working through the rest of her set, him stretching. And it wasn't an uncomfortable quiet. It was the kind that forms between people who have been in a bad situation together and come out the other side without having to explain why they felt calm around each other. Mercer wants to talk to you, Calvin said eventually. He didn't say it directly, but I've worked with him for 2 years and I know what it looks like when he wants to talk to someone and hasn't figured out how to start. She set the weights down. He's not good at it, Calvin added, talking. He does better when there's a problem to solve. The glacier was easy for him because there was always a problem in front of him. This He gestured vaguely at the base around them, meaning the aftermath, the debrief, the questions accumulating in every room she walked through. This is harder for him. She looked at Calvin for a moment. How do you know I want to talk to him? I don't, Calvin said. But I think you need to before Falk gets into whatever compartmented session he's planning. Once that starts, it's out of both your hands. She didn't answer that. She picked up her towel and left. She found Grant at the operations center, not inside it, but at the exterior door, standing with a cup of coffee and looking north toward the ridge systems that were barely visible through the cloud ceiling. The storm had weakened overnight. The blizzard had rolled through and left a heavy gray sky and a wind that was merely cold rather than violent. The mountains were dark shapes against slightly lighter darkness. He heard her coming. He didn't turn around. Falk is pulling your file today, he said. I know. The real one, not the current record. I know, she said again. He turned then. He looked at her in the gray early light with the coffee cup in one hand and the particular stillness he carried when something mattered to him, and he was deciding how much of that to show. Are you going to tell me, he said. What specifically? What you are. He said it without heat. Just the direct request of a man who had decided pretending the question didn't exist was less useful than asking it. She looked at the mountains. I was a sniper, she said. That part you've seen? That part I've seen. The rest of it is classified at a level that, legally, I cannot brief to you without Falk in the room, and a clearance verification I can't run from a forward base in the middle of nowhere. Legally, Grant said. Yes, but there's a version of this conversation that doesn't need to be legal. She looked at him. He looked back, steady and patient, with the coffee cooling in his hand. I worked for a program that doesn't officially exist, she said. I did work that officially never happened. I was very good at it for a long time. And then I stopped. She paused. I stopped because I needed to stop. I changed my identity, buried my record, and became a combat medic. Because being a combat medic means you spend every day trying to keep people alive, and that was something I needed badly enough to build an entire new life around. Silence. The wind moved between them. The rifle, Grant said. I kept it because I couldn't rule out needing it. And last night I needed it. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, a slow rotation, something to do with his hands while he processed. The shot you made, he said. 600 meters. In those conditions. That's not something you do twice a year at a range and maintain. No. That's something you do so many times, it stops being a skill and starts being a reflex. Yes. He looked at the mountains again. How many years? She didn't answer that. He didn't push it. The program you mentioned, he said, the one that doesn't officially exist. Is it the reason someone jammed our comms last night? She turned her head and looked at him directly. What makes you say that? Torres flagged it in the debrief. Active EW capability in a mountain corridor where irregular forces have historically operated with basic equipment. The jamming started the moment we entered the valley and lifted the moment it became operationally inconvenient to maintain. He paused. That's not a coincidence. That's a managed timeline. She said nothing. Someone wanted us in that valley without comms, Grant said. Someone knew our route. Someone positioned a shooter on that ridge who was good enough to eliminate Ironfall systematically and had the patience to wait for the recovery package. He looked at her. And the only thing that changed from their plan is that the recovery package included you. The wind pushed between them. I need you to tell me, he said. If there's something I'm walking my people into, if this is about you and not about the corridor, I need to know that. I don't know yet, she said. That's the honest answer. That's not a comfortable answer. No. He stared at her for a long moment. The gray light made him look older than he was, or maybe just closer to his actual age. Falk's session is at 1400 hours, he said. Whatever comes out of it, you should know that my people are walking around this base telling anyone who'll listen what happened on that glacier last night. That's not something I did. That's not something I can undo. She understood what he was telling her. The information was already distributed. It was already in the system, in the debrief records, in the accounts of 7 surviving soldiers and a flight crew. Whatever she'd been before last night, she was something different now. Not to the program that had made her, but to the people around her. I know, she said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't say it. He went back inside. Elena stood at the base entrance and looked north and felt the specific, unwelcome sensation of something she had buried with enormous care beginning to surface. The 1400-hour session with Falk lasted 90 minutes. It was held in a room Elena hadn't seen before, a secondary intelligence cell behind the main operations center, with a cipher lock on the door and a white noise generator mounted above the frame. The kind of room that said, before anyone spoke a word, "What happens in here doesn't leave this building." Falk sat across from her with a printed document in a red-bordered folder, and a second man Elena didn't recognize, introduced only as Mr. Cartwright, who wore civilian clothes and had the particular watchful quality of someone in a job that didn't have a clean title. Cartwright said almost nothing during the session. He watched Elena the way someone watches a complex piece of equipment they've been told to assess. Falk opened the session by reading from the document in front of him, not asking questions, but reading, which was his way of signaling that some of what he knew had already been verified before she walked in the door. He read a series of operational designations that Elena had not heard spoken aloud in 4 years, and her response to each, or her lack of visible response, which was itself a kind of response, told Falk and Cartwright more than any direct answer would have. When he finished reading, he set the document down. "You're listed as deceased," he said. "Yes." "The program closed your files 6 years ago." "That was the arrangement." "Whose arrangement?" She looked at him steadily. "The people who ran the program." "Where are those people now?" "Some of them are dead," she said. "The rest, I don't know." Cartwright made a note. His handwriting was small and precise, and he didn't look up while he wrote. "The weapon used on the glacier," Falk said. "We've had our armorers look at it. They describe it as a custom build using components from at least 3 different manufacturers, modified beyond factory specification in ways consistent with program-level fabrication." "That's accurate." "Where did you get it?" "I built it." A pause. "You built a program specification precision rifle from commercially available components," Falk said. "Over 2 years," Elena said. "I sourced the components separately, across different suppliers, using different identities. Nothing traceable to a single purchase." Cartwright stopped writing. He looked up at her for the first time since the session began. "Captain Cross," Falk said carefully, "the level of operational security you've described maintaining while serving as an active-duty combat medic suggests a continuity of tradecraft that goes considerably beyond what someone would employ if they simply wanted to put a pass behind them." She looked at him. "It suggests," he continued, "that you've been maintaining a level of readiness inconsistent with someone who genuinely believed they were retired." The white noise machine hummed. "What is it?" Cartwright said, his first words of the session quiet and unhurried. "That you believed you were preparing for?" She looked at him. She thought about the radio, the frequency notation she'd memorized, the 3 words, "She's still alive." "I don't know yet," she said, the same word she'd used with Grant. Still the honest answer. Cartwright studied her for another moment, then returned to his notepad. Falk closed the red-bordered folder. "You're going to remain on base," he said. "Medical grounds as well as operational seat. Captain Rourke's assessment stands. We'll be in contact with Hire regarding your status." He paused. "Is there anything you want to tell us that we haven't asked about?" A long silence. The white noise filled it. "The shooter on the ridge had a radio," Elena said. "Active at the time I reached his position. He transmitted a burst-encrypted signal on a frequency I can give you. The transmission was 3 words in English." She held Falk's gaze. "You should run a frequency trace, and you should do it quietly." She gave him the frequency notation. Falk wrote it down. He and Cartwright exchanged a glance that was brief and controlled, and meant something Elena filed for later. The session ended. The rest of the day at Whitmore had the specific quality of time, in a place where something has happened and everyone knows something has happened, but the official machinery hasn't finished deciding what to do about it yet. Elena ate in the dining facility and sat with Akita, who was out of the medical bay with his shoulder immobilized and his appetite apparently unaffected. He ate a plate of scrambled eggs and some kind of processed meat product and said, across the table, "Falk talk to you?" "Yes." "Cartwright there?" She looked at him. He kept eating. Thin guy, civilian clothes, takes notes like he's writing a verdict. You know him? Seen him before. 3 years ago, different base, different mountains. He paused. Different situation that turned out to be considerably more complicated than advertised. He stabbed a piece of egg. When Cartwright shows up, the complicated things get more complicated. Elena looked at her food. What happened 3 years ago? Nothing that got officially written down. Akita set his fork down and looked at her directly for the first time. He had the kind of eyes that had seen a lot and stopped pretending they hadn't. You're in something, Cross. I don't know what it is, and I'm not asking, but whatever it is, it came looking for you here. And that means it knew where here was. He picked up his fork again. She thought about that for the rest of the meal. At 1800 hours, Grant found her in the corridor outside the medical bay. He had the look of someone who had been in rooms making decisions for the last several hours and had emerged needing to be in a hallway for a minute. Falk brief you? She asked. Some of it. He stopped beside her and leaned against the wall. The frequency you gave him. Did it come back? He looked at her with an expression that was not quite the one she expected. Where'd you find the radio? On the shooter. Elena. He said her first name the way he had on the glacier. Flat and direct. Not a performance of intimacy, but a signal that the conversation had moved into territory where first names were the right register. The frequency Falk ran. It's not a hostile network frequency. She went very still. It's ours, Grant said. The transmission originated from our side of the mountain. The corridor was quiet around them. Whitmore's heating system pushed warm air through vents that ticked and clicked as the metal expanded. Someone on our net sent that transmission, she said. Someone with access to a burst encryption system that doesn't exist in any unit's equipment inventory at this base. His voice was controlled, careful. Falk is treating it as a technical anomaly pending further analysis. Is that what he's actually treating it as? A pause. No, Grant said, but that's what the official record says. She looked at the wall across from her. She ran the implications methodically, the way she ran everything. Sequence, cause, effect, probability. Someone on the friendly side of the mountain had sent a 3-word burst to a dead enemy shooter's radio. Someone who had known the shooter's frequency. Someone who had known he was dead because the transmission had come after the shot. Someone who had been watching the ridge. Who knew I was on the glacier, she said. The insertion manifest, the operations center, the flight crew. Grant paused. Everyone on our team. Who at this base knew my name before last night? He looked at her. Before we inserted, she said. Who on this base was briefed specifically that Elena Cross was on the recovery package? He was quiet for a moment. Falk received the full manifest 6 hours before insertion, standard protocol. And Cartwright? Grant's jaw tightened fractionally. Cartwright arrived at Whitmore 4 days ago. According to his credentials, he's an assessment officer on a routine evaluation cycle. When did Falk request the package? 5 days ago, when Ironfall went off net. 1 day before Cartwright arrived. She held that sequence in her mind and looked at it from every angle she could find, and each angle produced the same shape. Grant, she said. I know, he said. They stood in the corridor for a moment, the heating system ticking around them, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking because saying it in a hallway at a forward operating base was not the right context, and they both understood that without needing to discuss it. Get some sleep, he said finally. Medical review is 700 tomorrow. Falk will have another session after that. She nodded. He pushed off the wall and walked away down the corridor. She watched him go. She stood there for another minute in the ticking warmth of the hallway and thought about a program that had officially died 6 years ago, and a shooter on a ridge who had received a transmission from the friendly side of the mountain and 3 words that someone had spoken, knowing she was alive. She thought about Cartwright's small, precise handwriting. She thought about the way he had looked up from his notepad when she'd described building the rifle. Not with surprise, with something more like recognition. She went to her quarters. She did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed of a mountain she'd been on before this one, in a different country, a different year, and a radio transmission that had said something entirely different from those 3 words. something that had ended a life she'd been living for 11 years and started the process of building the one she had now. She woke at 0230 to the sound of boots in the corridor outside her door. Not one set. Multiple. Moving with the specific controlled urgency of people who had been briefed on exactly where they were going and why. She was off the cot and moving before she was fully awake, the muscle memory of every bad room she'd ever been in carrying her body through the right actions while her mind caught up, her hand reaching for the medical ruck in the corner. The ruck that now held only medical supplies, because Falk had the rifle. The boots stopped outside her door. A knock. Not soft. Captain Cross, Falk's voice. Open the door, please. She opened it. Falk stood in the corridor with two military police, both armed, both wearing the careful, neutral expressions of people executing an order they hadn't been given a full explanation for. Behind them, slightly to the right, stood Cartwright. He was wearing a jacket she hadn't seen him in before. It looked like the kind of jacket you put on when you're going outside. We need you to come with us, Falk said. Where? Falk looked at her with the expression of a careful man who had just received information that had made him more careful. There's been a development. We'll brief you in the operations center. What kind of development? Captain. His voice was steady. Please. She read the corridor. Falk she trusted, conditionally. The MPs were following protocol. Cartwright was standing at the right rear position. Not behind Falk, not beside him, but at a slight remove that was the natural position of someone who was neither superior nor subordinate, but something else. Someone managing an outcome. She looked at Cartwright. He looked back at her with the same watchful quality he'd had in the session. Assessing, calibrated, giving away nothing. She picked up her jacket. She followed them down the corridor. Behind her, in the empty room, her medical ruck sat in the corner exactly as she'd left it, except the ruck had 4 external pockets. She'd left all 4 zipped. The bottom left was open. Someone had been in her room before Falk knocked. She stopped walking before they reached the first corner. It wasn't a dramatic stop. No announcement. She simply ceased moving, and the 2 MPs and Falk took 3 more steps before they registered it and turned around. And Cartwright, who had been trailing at his careful remove, stopped exactly when she did, which told her something. The bottom left pocket of my ruck, she said. Someone opened it. Falk looked at her without expression. Captain, it was zipped when I left for dinner. It was zipped when I came back. It was open 2 minutes ago. She looked at Cartwright. The room was locked. Base security has master access, Falk said. Who authorized it? A pause. Short, but real. We need to get to the operations center, Falk said. Tell me who authorized a search of my quarters without notifying me, and I'll walk anywhere you want. Falk looked at Cartwright. Cartwright said, I did. His voice was the same unhurried register it had been in the session. Calm, the way things are, calm when they've made their decision, and stopped caring about reception. On what authority? She said. The authority relevant to your original program. He held her gaze. Which you understand better than anyone in this corridor. She understood it. She didn't like what she understood. You found nothing because there's nothing to find. I know, Cartwright said. Then why? To see how fast you'd notice. He tilted his head slightly, a minimal gesture. 11 seconds from the room to this point in the corridor. That's faster than I expected. The corridor held its warm, ticking silence. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The MPs were watching the exchange the way people watch something they can tell is happening on a frequency they can't quite tune to. What's the development? She said. Operations Center, Falk said. Please. She walked. The main display screen in the operations center showed a satellite image, cloud-obscured, partially processed, the kind of imagery that came from a tasked asset rather than a scheduled pass. The image covered the valley north of Whitmore, including the ridge system where Elena had made her shot 14 hours earlier. There were thermal signatures on it that hadn't been there before. Not a few. Many. Torres was at the imagery workstation, looking like he hadn't slept, which he probably hadn't. He pulled up a zoomed section without being asked, and the count became clearer. 40-plus distinct heat sources moving through the valley in a formation that wasn't random. When did this start? Elena asked. Movement began around midnight, Torres said. We've been tracking for 3 hours. They're not using the standard corridor routes. They're using the northeast approach, she said. How do you... Because that's where I'd go. She studied the screen. The formation was organized, disciplined, moving with purpose, rather than the loose reactive scatter of a force that had been surprised. They know we eliminated their overwatch. They're not approaching through the same valley. They're coming around. Coming around to where? Oak said. He was standing to her left, arms crossed, with the expression of someone who had come back from a patrol, gotten 2 hours of sleep, and was now being told the situation had evolved. She traced the movement pattern on the screen with her finger, not touching the display, just indicating direction. The northeast approach puts them at the base perimeter in approximately 4 hours if they maintain this pace, maybe 3.5 if they push the saddle crossing in the dark. That's a 40 below crossing, Grant said from behind her. She turned. He was in the doorway, jacket on, looking like he'd been awake when they came for her. He moved to the display and stood beside her, studying it. They did the glacier crossing in a blizzard last night, she said. The saddle is easier than the glacier. The room was quiet. The operations center had the particular compressed quality of a space where people are rapidly revising their understanding of how much danger they are in. Falk spoke from the back of the room. Current base garrison is 42 personnel. 12 are non-combat support. We have 1 operational element, Bravo, at reduced strength given last night's action and the casualties still in medical. What's Bravo's actual fighting strength right now? Grant asked. 6, Oakes said. He said it without hesitation because he'd already run it. 7 if you count Aikido with 1 shoulder. 8, Elena said. Everyone looked at her. 8 if you count me, she said. You have a fractured fibula, Falk said. I also have the only read on how this element operates, where they set up, and how their overwatch integrates with their assault force. She looked at Falk. You gave my rifle to your armorers. Yes, I need it back. A silence. Captain Cross, Falk said carefully, your status on this base is currently Major. Her voice didn't rise. It went the other direction, quieter, which in her experience carried farther. There are 40-plus combat personnel 4 hours from this perimeter, and they came here because of me. I'm not going to sit in the medical bay while your garrison tries to hold a perimeter without knowing what they're facing. She held his gaze. Give me the rifle. Falk looked at Cartwright. Cartwright, for the first time since Elena had met him, showed something in his expression that wasn't pure assessment, something that might, in a different man, have been acknowledgement. He gave one small nod. Falk looked at Torres. Get the rifle from the armory. They had 3 hours and 40 minutes. Grant ran the planning cycle with the flat efficiency of someone who had done crisis planning in worse conditions with less time, which he had. The base had a defensive perimeter with 3 fixed positions, north, east, and west, plus the main gate to the south. The northeast approach, if Elena's read on the thermal imagery was right, would bring the hostile element in between the north and east positions, through a dead ground section that the perimeter hadn't been designed to cover because until last night, no one had considered it a realistic avenue of approach. It was a realistic avenue of approach. We need an observation post on the saddle, Grant said. Someone who can give us early warning and slow the approach if they hit the crossing earlier than projected. The saddle is 2,800 meters, Oakes said. Night movement, compromised terrain. I know what the saddle is. I'll go, Elena said. Your leg can manage the saddle. The fracture is distal and stable. She looked at Grant. I've climbed worse on worse legs. And if they push the crossing early, I can take the high point and give you 20 extra minutes of warning. Grant looked at her for a moment. She could see him running the same calculation she was. Her medical value to the base versus her tactical value on the saddle, which was not an easy calculation when the base doctor was awake and functional, and the tactical situation on the saddle was specific to her skill set. If they push the crossing, he said slowly, and you're on the saddle, I can delay them, not stop them, but delay them. By yourself. I've worked alone before. He held her gaze for a moment that wasn't quite long enough to be called a stare. Then he looked at Torres. Get her a radio, our frequency, not standard base net. He looked back at her. You go up there. You work on my channel, not Falk's, not Cartwright's, mine. She understood the distinction. Understood. If you take contact you cannot manage, you break off and come down. You do not make a stand on that saddle alone. Agreed. He didn't look entirely convinced that she meant it. He was probably right not to be. But he nodded because the tactical logic was sound, and they were running out of time for conversations about it. She left the wire at 03:15 hours, moving northeast through the last of the storm's residue. A ground-level drift that pushed knee-high in the open sections and chest-high in the terrain folds. The boot made the movement awkward and painful in the specific way of walking on something that wanted to flex and wasn't being allowed to, and she managed the pain by not thinking about it, which was a skill she had developed in the years before she became a medic and used more often than she wanted to admit. The rifle was assembled and slung. She carried it the way she carried the medical ruck, with the specific economy of someone who had learned long ago that extra movement cost heat and heat cost time. She climbed. The saddle crossing was a natural choke point between two ridge systems, a narrow col at altitude with steep approaches on both sides. Anyone moving through the Northeast Valley in quantity had to cross it or add 8 kilometers to their route. The question was not whether the hostile element would use it. The question was how fast. She reached the approach to the saddle at 04:47 hours, 52 minutes after leaving the wire. Her fibula was a steady complaint that she categorized and filed. She found a position on the east side of the col, behind a natural rock formation that gave her line of sight north while keeping her silhouette below the skyline, extended the bipod, and settled in. She listened to the mountain. The mountain was not quiet. They hit the crossing 40 minutes ahead of her projection, not the full element, a 12-man lead element, moving with the kind of controlled speed that said they'd been here before or had people who had. They came up the north face of the saddle in 2 files, flanking the col, using the terrain the way professional soldiers use terrain, which was different from the way irregular forces use terrain, and told her something she flagged immediately. She keyed the radio. "Bravo Actual, this is Cross, lead element on the saddle, 12 personnel, 40 minutes ahead of schedule." Grant's voice came back within 3 seconds. "Copy." "How organized?" "Very. 2-file approach, flanking movement, noise discipline. These are not the same quality as what we faced in the valley." A pause. She could hear, in the background of his transmission, the sound of the operations center reorganizing around the new information. "Hold as long as you can," Grant said. She had exactly 1 thermal observation tool. A monocular Torres had pressed into her hand at the wire. And she used it now, working the north face of the saddle to find the rest of the element. The lead 12 had crested the col. The main body was still on the north face, strung out in the narrow approach. She counted, 20, 30, still coming. 47 when the last of them cleared the base of the approach. "Full element on the crossing," she transmitted. 47 personnel, possibly more outside thermal range. Main body is still on the north face. Copy 47. "Bravo Actual, the lead element has 2 personnel who are moving differently from the rest." She tracked them in the monocular. "Lighter kit. Different gait. They're not shooters, Grant. They're spotters. They're looking for something." A silence. "Looking for what?" Grant said. She didn't answer that because she already knew, and the answer wasn't something she wanted on the radio. They were looking for her. She let the lead element clear the saddle. She held position, breathing the thin, cold air, counting the main body through the col. When 2/3 of the element had crossed, she found the narrowest point of the crossing, a 6-meter section where the rock walls compressed the route to single-file width, and made her decision. She had 3 rounds in the specific load she'd chosen for the altitude and temperature. She used one on a boulder at the north edge of the narrow section. The round hit a specific stress fracture in the rock that she'd identified in the 40 minutes of observation, and the fracture opened, and a section of the boulder faced the size of a dining table broke loose and fell across the crossing route with a sound like a building coming down. The main body of the element stopped moving. The lead 12, already past the saddle, already committed to the southern approach, could not easily go back. She had just cut the element in half. She keyed the radio. "Bravo Actual. Main body is stopped at the crossing. Lead element of 12 is committed, moving south toward you. Main body will take 20 to 40 minutes to find an alternate route around the obstruction." Dead air for 2 seconds. Then, "Did you just drop a rock on them?" "A large rock." She heard something in his transmission that was, briefly and unprofessionally, close to amusement. It died quickly. "Copy. We'll handle the lead 12 this side. Get off the saddle." "On my way." She was already moving, stripping the bipod, breaking down the firing position with the automatic efficiency of long practice, erasing the physical evidence of her presence with the care of someone for whom that habit had once been the difference between walking away and not walking away. She was 60 meters south of the position, moving down slope, when the radio crackled with Torres's voice. All stations, East perimeter is taking fire." She stopped moving. East perimeter, not south, not from the saddle approach. The east perimeter, which was not the direction the thermal imagery had shown any movement, which meant the 47-person element crossing the saddle had not been the primary threat. It had been the distraction. "Bravo actual," she transmitted, already moving faster than her leg wanted her to move. "The saddle push is a feint. What's the size of the east contact?" Grant's voice came back with the flat tone of someone managing multiple things simultaneously. "Significant. We're engaged." "How significant?" A pause. Gunfire audible through the transmission now. The distinctive overlapping crack of multiple weapons. Close. "Cross, get back inside the wire." "How many?" "Get back in the wire. Now." She was already running. She came in through the south gate at a controlled sprint that cost her more than she wanted to acknowledge, and the base she returned to was a different texture from the one she'd left. The specific urgent chaos of a facility taking contact, personnel moving between positions with weapons up. The operations center lit hard with every screen active. She found Grant at the north position, behind the primary defensive berm, with Oakes on his left and 2 garrison soldiers on his right, who looked young and were maintaining their composure by some combination of training and sheer stubbornness. The east perimeter was holding, barely. "Lead 12 from the saddle are in the dead ground," Oakes said without looking away from his sector. "They know the gap. They're working it." "The east contact," Elena said. "Where did they come from?" "West Ridge," Grant said. "They were there all night, pre-positioned before we picked up the northeast movement." She processed that. "The thermal imagery. The northeast movement was deliberate. They wanted us watching north while the West Ridge element set up." "Yes." "How many on the east?" 30, maybe more. We can't get a clean count in the dark." She looked at the defensive layout. 42 base personnel, 12 of them non-combat. 6 functional Bravo operators. 1 sergeant major with a functioning shoulder and a rifle. 1 combat medic with a fractured leg and 3 rounds remaining. Against an element that had split itself into at least 3 components: lead element from the saddle, east contact, and the main body she'd held at the crossing who would find their alternate route in 20 minutes. She looked at the north position setup. The fixed gun was covering the approach from the saddle adequately. 2 of the garrison soldiers knew what they were doing. The east perimeter was the problem. Whoever was pressing the east side had found a fold in the terrain that gave them a covered approach to within 80 meters of the wire, and from 80 meters with numbers they could push the garrison off the position. "The east fold," she said, "Inky. You need someone on the north side of it." "The north side of it is outside the wire," Grant said. "I know." He turned from his sector and looked at her. His face had the particular quality it got when he was about to disagree with something he knew he didn't have a counterargument for. "Elena, I'm not going into the fold. I'm going to the high point northeast of it." She indicated the direction with her head. 20 meters outside the wire. Natural elevation. From there I have a line of sight into the fold's covered approach section. You have 3 rounds. I only need 3. The east perimeter lit up with another exchange. Shorter this time, the garrison finding their rhythm, but the incoming was heavier than it should have been, which meant the east element was receiving reinforcement from somewhere. Grant looked at the east perimeter. He looked at her. He looked at the northeast high point she'd indicated, which was 20 meters outside the wire and completely exposed, and also, from a pure geometry standpoint, exactly the right place to put a precision shooter to break the east element's covered approach. "If you take a hit outside the wire," he said, "then I'm a casualty and you treat me accordingly." That is not a reassuring answer. It's an honest one. He held her gaze for one more second. 3 rounds, he said. You fire 3 rounds and then you come back in. You do not stay out there. 3 rounds, she agreed. She went over the wire. Shab. The northeast high point was a natural shelf of granite, ice-rimmed and narrow, that gave her a direct angle into the covered fold where the east element was staging its approach. She settled into position with the speed of someone who had been doing this since before Grant Mercer had made sergeant, bipod down, cheek to stock, eye to scope. She found them. 31 personnel in the fold, moving in three-man rushes toward the wire, using the terrain brake for cover with the professional timing of practiced assault movement. The fold's north wall, the wall she was looking over, was their blind spot. They had planned for fire from the wire, from the south. They hadn't planned for someone outside the wire on their north flank. She began to understand, watching them move, that she had seen this methodology before. Not this specific element, but this specific approach pattern, this timing, this integration of feint and main effort. She had seen it in a file she'd read 11 years ago, in a briefing room that officially hadn't existed, preparing for an operation that was officially never carried out. The realization moved through her like cold water. She didn't stop what she was doing. She breathed out. Found the lead element, the one setting the timing for the three-man rushes, the one who, if she removed him from the equation, would cause the following elements to hesitate and lose their rhythm. She tracked him for 2 seconds. First round. The lead man went down and the fold erupted in confused movement, the beautiful clockwork of a rehearsed assault suddenly running without its conductor. She shifted left, found the secondary command node, the one already moving to restore order, already gesturing to reestablish the assault rhythm. Second round. The fold movement stopped entirely for 11 seconds, which was enough time for Grant's garrison soldiers on the east perimeter to redistribute and tighten their coverage and push back against an assault that had lost its momentum. She had 1 round left. She moved the scope across the fold, cataloging, not yet committing to a target, waiting for the picture to resolve itself into the next most important thing. What she found in the scope was not what she expected. In the back of the fold, sheltered, not moving, watching the assault unfold with the still attention of someone directing rather than participating, was a man in different kit from the rest, not the mountain gear of the assault element. Something older, more layered, the equipment of someone who had been in mountain environments long enough to develop preferences that diverged from whatever their quartermaster issued. He was holding a radio. He turned briefly, and his face caught the ambient light. She had seen that face before. Not here, not in this mountain, in a photograph, in a briefing room that hadn't officially existed, in the same briefing where she'd read the file she'd just thought about 30 seconds ago. He was supposed to be dead. She had made sure he was dead. 11 years ago, in a different mountain, in a different country, she had made a shot that had closed the file on an operation and ended a program, and eventually, through the chain of consequences that followed, ended the life she'd been living and started the one she had now. He was supposed to be dead. Her heart rate, which had been running at 53 beats per minute throughout the engagement, did something involuntary and uncomfortable. She noticed it. She breathed through it. She put her eye back to the scope and found him again, and confirmed what she was seeing with the methodical disbelief of someone whose entire understanding of the last 6 years had just rearranged itself around a single image. He was looking directly at her position. He couldn't see her. The angle in the darkness made that impossible, but he was looking at exactly the right place. She's still alive. He'd sent those words. He hadn't been warning anyone. He'd been telling someone she was still alive, in the tone of someone reporting an unexpected complication rather than a threat, in the tone of someone who had assumed otherwise. She had 1 round left. She had a man in her scope who had apparently survived something she'd been told and had believed was unsurvivable, who had rebuilt something she'd destroyed, who had come to this specific mountain, to this specific base, because she was here. Her finger was on the trigger. She breathed out. The fold below was chaos. The east perimeter was holding. Grant's voice came over the radio with a brevity that meant things were stable enough for him to check. Cross, status. She didn't answer immediately. The man in the scope turned his head and spoke into his radio, and then turned back and looked at her position with the absolute certainty of someone who had already decided what came next. She put the crosshairs on him. Her heart was not at 53 anymore. Cross, Grant said again, sharper now. 3rd round. Status. She breathed. She held him in the scope for 3 full seconds. Then she stood up. She broke down the position in 9 seconds, stripped the rifle, and went back over the wire at a pace her leg protested violently and that she ignored completely. She didn't fire the third round. The man in the fold watched her position go dark, and in the operations center 3 minutes later, when the East element broke contact and withdrew with a cleanness that was more organized than a defeated force had any right to be, Cartwright, who had been standing in the back of the room throughout the engagement, took out his phone, looked at a message on it, and put it back in his pocket. His expression, for just a moment, was not the careful nothing it usually was. It was relief. Cartwright put his phone in his pocket, and Elena watched him do it. She was standing at the operations center entrance, still moving from the wire, her legs sending clear signals that she had stopped being able to categorize as manageable approximately 10 minutes ago. The room was cycling down from contact tempo, personnel redistributing, Torres pulling the radio net back to monitoring posture, the garrison soldiers at the east perimeter calling in their status in the flat professional shorthand of people who had held their position and knew it. The east element had broken contact cleanly, too cleanly for a force that had taken 2 leadership casualties and lost its assault momentum. Broken contact meant command decision. Command decision meant someone in that fold had made a deliberate choice to pull back rather than press the advantage of numbers. She looked at Cartwright's jacket pocket where the phone had disappeared. He felt her looking. He turned. They looked at each other across the operations center. Neither of them said anything. Grant came through the side door with Oakes behind him, both of them carrying the residual heat of men who had just been running and shooting and were now required to downshift into something that required different muscles. Grant read the room in 3 seconds, the way he always read rooms, fast and systematic, and his eyes landed on Elena and stayed there. "You didn't fire the third round," he said. "No." "Why?" She looked at Cartwright again, briefly, then back at Grant. "I need the debriefing room. We're debriefing here." "No," she said. "We're not." The cipher-locked room had the same white noise generator, the same spare table, the same institutional quality of a space designed to make people feel that what was said inside it had weight. Falk sat at the head of the table, Grant to his left. Oakes, because Grant had insisted and Falk had chosen not to fight it, against the wall. Cartwright sat across from Elena. She put the rifle on the table between them, still broken down, components in order, the way she always returned it. She looked at Cartwright and said, "Tell me his name." "Whose name?" Falk said. "The man in the fold," Elena said. She didn't look away from Cartwright. Back position, separate kit, running the element's radio traffic. He watched my position go dark and he pulled the east contact. Not because they'd lost. They still had numbers enough to push the perimeter. He pulled them because I didn't fire. Silence. "The third round," Grant said quietly. "If I'd fired the third round, he would have kept pushing," Elena said. "He pulled back because I didn't, because not firing was a signal." "A signal of what?" Falk said. "That I recognized him." She paused. "And that I wanted to talk more than I wanted him dead." Falk looked at Cartwright. Cartwright looked at the rifle on the table. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite discomfort, but was adjacent to it. "His name is Victor Solon," Cartwright said. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Falk's pen stopped moving. Grant looked at Cartwright with the expression of a man who has just realized that the intelligence officer in the room knew considerably more walking into this session than he'd disclosed. "Who is Victor Solon?" "He was the operational director of a program that no longer exists," Cartwright said. "A program that Captain Cross was a primary asset of." "Was," Elena said. "Was," Cartwright agreed, "until apparently he wasn't." "I made the shot that closed his file," she said, 11 years ago. "I was briefed that he died at the scene. I was shown documentation, medical examiner report, site photographs, confirmation from 2 independent sources." "All fabricated," Cartwright said. She had known this since the moment she'd seen Solon's face in the scope. Knowing it didn't make hearing it said aloud in a lit room feel any less like a structural failure. 6 years of a rebuilt life predicated on a piece of information that had been manufactured. "Why?" she said. Cartwright was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. "Because Solon's program didn't end when your operation closed it. It continued under different infrastructure, different funding. The people running it needed you to believe the threat was eliminated so you'd stop operating. So I'd stop being a problem. So you'd stop being a variable, he said. There's a difference. Not from where I'm standing. Grant had been listening to this exchange with the controlled attention of a man absorbing information faster than he could interrogate it. What is Solon doing in this mountain corridor, he said. He's been here for 8 months, Cartwright said, using the corridor as an operational staging ground. The weapons movement, the irregular forces, that's cover. The real operation is infrastructure. He's been rebuilding the network that your original program was designed to dismantle. Using this corridor specifically, Elena said, because it's contested enough to provide cover and remote enough to limit oversight, and because, Cartwright paused again, because 6 months ago he learned that Elena Cross was alive, that she hadn't died when the program closed her file, that she was serving as a combat medic in the region. The white noise machine filled the silence. He came here for her, Grant said. The ambush on Iron Fall, Cartwright said, the recovery package he anticipated. The EW jamming, the ridge shooter, the saddle approach, the West Ridge pre-position, none of it was about the corridor. It was an architecture designed to put Elena Cross in a specific situation. What situation? Falk said. Isolated, identified, forced to reveal capability. Cartwright looked at Elena. He needed to confirm it was you before he could move forward. Move forward with what? Cartwright folded his hands on the table. It was the first slightly human gesture she'd seen from him. Solon doesn't want you dead, Captain. He wants you back. The room held that sentence for a moment. Oakes, from the wall, said, back. The program he's rebuilding requires a precision asset of your specific caliber, Cartwright said. There are perhaps 4 people alive who operate at the level you demonstrated on this glacier over the last 18 hours. Solon trained most of them. He trained you. He ran me, Elena said. The distinction was important, and the edge in her voice made that clear. He didn't train me. I came to the program with the skill. He pointed it at things and told me they needed to die. Cartwright absorbed the correction without reacting to it. He believes you'll come back voluntarily. Why would he believe that? Because you didn't fire the 3rd round. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Fuller, more complicated. She looked at her hands on the table, not at the rifle. At her hands, which were the hands of a medic, scarred along the right palm from a field procedure 3 years ago, calloused differently than they'd been when she'd only ever used them for shooting, slightly stiff in the cold the way hands got after 40 years of altitude and weather. I didn't fire the 3rd round because I needed information, she said. Not because I'm open to a conversation. Solon won't read it that way. I know. That's why I need to find him before he decides the conversation is already happening on his terms. Grant straightened slightly. Find him. He's still in the corridor. He didn't extract with the assault elements. That's not how he operates. He'll have a separate position, separate exfil, and he'll be waiting to see what my next move is. She looked at Grant. He's been watching me for 6 months. He knows my patterns. He knows how I think. Then this is a trap, Grant said. Going after him is exactly what he expects. Yes, and you want to do it anyway. I want to finish what I started 11 years ago, she said, which I apparently didn't. Falk set his pen down with more deliberateness than the action required. Captain Cross, what you're describing is an unsanctioned offensive operation outside the wire against a target of unknown position with unknown force protection, using a base in reduced defensive strength in mountain terrain at night. He looked at her carefully. I can't authorize that. I'm not asking you to authorize it, she said. I'm telling you what I intend to do. That's not how this... Major, Grant's voice, quiet and final. Falk stopped. Grant looked at Elena. You said he knows how you think. Yes. So he knows you'll come after him. Yes. Which means he has something prepared. He always has something prepared. Grant was quiet for a moment. He looked at the rifle on the table. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had revised his understanding of Elena Cross approximately 6 times in the last 24 hours and was preparing to revise it again. You're not going alone, he said. Grant, that's not negotiable. He looked at Oakes. Oakes, for the first time nodded without being asked. Grant looked back at her. Two of us. You navigate, I cover your back. We find him, we confirm, and then we make a decision that doesn't require you to carry alone. She looked at him for a long moment. Two people are harder to conceal than one in this terrain, she said. I know. He'll know we're coming. He already knows you're coming. Having me there changes the picture enough to be worth the cost. He held her gaze. You've been the only variable he hasn't fully accounted for. I'm a second variable. Variables compound. She didn't have a clean counter to that. Fine, she said. Cartwright said, I should come. Both Elena and Grant looked at him simultaneously, and the look was similar enough that it might have been coordinated. No, Elena said. I have information about Solon's operational patterns that... You've had that information since before I arrived at this base, she said. You've been managing this situation from the moment you got here. Whatever you know about Solon's patterns, you're going to tell me right now in this room before we go anywhere. She held his gaze. And then you're going to stay here. Cartwright studied her. Because, she continued, the man in the fold looked at my position when I didn't fire, and then he pulled his element back, and then you got a message on your phone and you looked relieved. She put that sentence on the table the same way she'd put the rifle on it. Without drama, without accusation, just the object itself placed where everyone could see it. I don't know what that means yet, but until I do, you're not standing behind me on a mountain in the dark. The white noise machine hummed. Falk was looking at Cartwright with the expression of someone who had just realized there were dimensions to the situation that hadn't been in his briefing. Cartwright looked at Elena for a long moment. Then he said, He has a hide position on the east ridge, above the fold where you spotted him. Pre-constructed, probably established when he first moved into the corridor. He'll have one exit route north and one west, and he'll use whichever one gives him higher ground. He paused. He won't leave the corridor tonight. He's not done here. Why not? Grant said. Cartwright looked at Elena. Because she didn't fire, but see. They went out the wire at 0130 hours, 2 hours after the East Element's withdrawal, when the mountain had settled back into the deep, cold quiet that passed for normalcy up here. Elena moved on her fractured leg with the specific grim determination of someone who had categorized pain as information rather than instruction, and had decided this particular information was not currently relevant. Grant moved beside her and slightly behind, covering her right side, and he moved the way she had come to expect him to move, without wasted motion, without noise, with the patient mechanical precision of someone who had spent years turning the act of moving through dangerous terrain into something that looked almost effortless and wasn't. They didn't talk. The East Ridge was 400 meters from the wire, rising steeply through a section of mixed rock and ice that would have been challenging in daylight and was something considerably less friendly at 0130. Elena picked the route through it by feel and memory, and the specific spatial intelligence that let her hold a terrain map in her mind and navigate by it in the dark. At 250 meters, she stopped. She pressed her fist back. Stop. And Grant froze immediately. She listened. Nothing wrong about the sound. But something wrong about the absence of sound. The specific pocket of silence that didn't fit the ambient noise pattern of the ridge. Not the loaded silence of an ambush. Something else. Someone waiting who didn't particularly care if she found him. She turned to Grant and put 2 fingers to her eyes. I see something. Then pointed up the ridge to a position 40 meters northeast. He looked. She watched him parse the darkness and find the shape she'd found. The outline of a constructed position against the natural rock. Subtle enough that she only caught it because she'd built enough of them to know what they looked like from the outside. He nodded. She moved toward it. Victor Solon was sitting with his back against the east wall of the hide, a thermos in one hand and a radio in the other, and he looked at Elena when she came around the rock face with the expression of a man who had been expecting this for some time and had made his peace with however it went. He was older than this photograph. Of course he was. Well, 11 years was 11 years, and whatever he'd done to survive whatever she'd done to him had left marks that the photograph hadn't had. He was heavier in the shoulders and thinner in the face, and his right hand, she noticed, didn't move quite right around the thermos. She had done that. He looked at her and said, in English that carried the accent of a country she knew but wouldn't name, I wondered if you'd come tonight or wait until morning. Tonight, she said. I thought so. He looked past her at Grant, who had come around the rock face with his rifle up and was holding a position that covered both Solon and his exit routes simultaneously. Your Sergeant Major. Yes? He's good. He is. Solon looked back at her. He didn't move toward his own weapon, which was visible, a pistol on his right hip, and which he was making no effort to draw or hide. You saw me in the fold. Yes. And you didn't fire. No. He considered that. Because you had questions. Because I had one bullet left and I wanted information more than I wanted you dead. She paused. That calculation could change. He almost smiled. It was the expression of a man who had heard a threat he believed and also found the directness of it slightly satisfying. You were always the most honest person in any room, he said. It was your best quality and your most significant operational liability. Tell me how you survived. He turned the thermos in his damaged hand. The shot was good, he said. It was an excellent shot. It would have killed anyone who didn't have the specific anatomical anomaly I have. My heart is positioned 3 centimeters further right than normal presentation. The round passed through the left side of my chest cavity and clipped the pericardium rather than the organ itself. He paused. I was told my survival probability was 4%. The 4% was apparently available. She absorbed this without expression. The specific 4% probability that had unraveled 6 years of her rebuilt life. The documentation, she said, the medical examiner report, the photographs. Produced by people who had reasons to want both of us to believe the situation was closed, Solon said. I was as deceived as you were initially. I spent 3 years recovering before I understood what had happened. Who produced it? The program's oversight committee, the people above me. He paused. They wanted the program closed. You were getting too effective. I was getting too autonomous. Closing both of us simultaneously was cleaner than managing either of us separately. They made me think I'd killed you, and they made me think I'd barely survived you, which served their purposes differently. He tilted his head slightly. I spent 3 years thinking you knew I was alive, that you'd chosen not to finish what you started, that the clean official story was your cover. And when you found out I believed you were dead? I found out 6 months ago, when I confirmed you were alive and operating as a medic. Something shifted in his face. You genuinely walked away. Yes, you built a new life. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. The mountain wind moved between them. I couldn't, he said, and the simplicity of it was more human than anything else he'd said. I tried. For 3 years while I recovered, I considered it. But this? He gestured vaguely at the dark ridge around him. This is the only thing I know how to do. And the network I spent 20 years building was still there, functioning under different management, being used for things I hadn't intended. He looked at her. I came back to dismantle it, correctly this time. The attack on Whitmore. I needed to understand what the Corridor Command would do when pressed. I needed to see the defensive patterns. You killed 3 of Ironfall's people to run a reconnaissance of base defensive patterns, Grant said from his position. His voice was controlled, and the control was doing a lot of work. Solon looked at him. I didn't order the deaths of those soldiers. The ridge shooter acted outside my instruction. He was the Corridor Command's asset, not mine. They placed him there, and I couldn't extract him without burning my position. His voice didn't carry the quality of excuse, just the flat accounting of what had happened. I'm responsible for putting the operation in motion. The specific deaths are on the Corridor Command. The distinction may not matter to you. It doesn't, Grant said. I know. Solon looked back at Elena. I came here for you, not to recruit you, to warn you. The committee that closed both our files, they're not finished. When they learned you were alive, the calculus changed again. They need you gone more than they needed me gone, because you're operational and I'm, demonstrably, surviving. He paused. Cartwright works for them. The cold moved across the ridge like something with intention. Cartwright, Elena said. His evaluation posting at Whitmore was arranged 4 days before Ironfall went off-net, before the recovery package was assembled, before anyone knew you'd be inserted into the corridor. He watched her process this. He was placed to manage the outcome, whichever outcome presented itself. She thought about Cartwright's phone, the message, the relief. He was relieved, she said, thinking aloud. When the East element withdrew, when I didn't fire. Because if you'd killed me, Solon said, the information I'm giving you now dies with me, and the committee's exposure dies with me, and you remain a managed variable with no understanding of why you're being managed. He paused. His message told him I was still alive. He was relieved because a living me is more useful to his principals than a dead one, in the short term, while they determine their next approach. Grant lowered his rifle slightly. Not all the way, but enough that it meant something. He looked at Elena. She looked at Solon. Give me the committee, she said. Names, infrastructure, documentation. I have it, Solon said. I've been building it for 3 years. It's in a format that survives me, transmitted to 3 separate locations, released on a schedule that requires me to actively prevent it. If I disappear, it releases automatically. A dead man's switch. I've had 11 years of being dead, he said. I've learned its utility. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his damaged hand. She looked at the hide he'd built on this ridge. Careful, professional, built by someone who had been building hides for a very long time and had stopped expecting to be found. You came to this ridge expecting me to come up here tonight, she said. Yes. With 1 bullet. You don't need more than 1, with me. You proved that. He paused. But you came to talk, which means you already know the 3rd round wasn't the right answer. She hated that he was correct. Tell me how we do this, she said. They came off the ridge at 0340 hours, all 3 of them, which was not the configuration Elena had left with and which Grant had complicated feelings about that he was managing through silence and forward movement. Solon walked between them with his weapon surrendered, handed to Grant without being asked, an acknowledgement of the geometry of the situation that Grant had accepted without comment. Elena's leg was at the threshold of what she would honestly call manageable and had been there for 40 minutes. She moved through it. 50 meters from the wire, her radio crackled. Cross, Falk's voice. What is your status? She keyed. Coming in. 3 personnel. A pause. 3. Another pause, longer. Copy. Gate is open. The operations center at 0400 hours had Falk, Torres, and 2 garrison duty personnel, and Cartwright standing at the back of the room where he'd been standing for the last 4 hours. He saw Solon come through the door, and his face did something that was not quite any single readable emotion. It was the face of a man whose calculations had just undergone a significant revision. Grant crossed the room in 8 steps and stopped in front of Cartwright. Your phone, Grant said. Cartwright looked at him. The message you received when the East element withdrew, Grant said. I need to see it. Sergeant Major, you don't have the authority to. Show me the message or I'll have Torres pull the base communication logs and find whatever frequency you used to receive it, which will take him about 40 minutes and will produce a paper trail significantly less comfortable for you than just showing me the message. Grant held out his hand. Your choice. Cartwright looked at Grant's hand. He looked at Elena, who was standing with Solon near the door, watching. He took out the phone and held it out. Grant looked at the message. He read it twice. He handed the phone to Falk, who read it and set it on the operations center table with the particular deliberateness of someone setting something down that they want other people to see clearly. Sit down, Mr. Cartwright, Falk said. Cartwright sat. Falk looked at the message on the screen. He looked at Solon. He looked at Elena. He was assembling a picture that he'd had parts of for 4 hours and had just received the remaining pieces, and the picture it made was not one that reflected well on the oversight chain above his pay grade. I need a secure line to SOCOM, Falk said to Torres. Not the standard relay, the alternate channel. Yes, sir. And I need it now. Torres moved. Elena walked to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down because her leg had stopped asking and started demanding, and the threshold she'd been managing had just been revised significantly downward. She put her hands flat on the table and breathed and looked at the room around her. The operations center, the duty personnel, Grant standing over Cartwright with a stillness that communicated everything. Solon in the corner with the particular quality of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. Falk looked at her across the table. Are you all right? The fibula, she said. I'll need Rourke. He nodded and told one of the duty personnel to get the doctor. She sat with her hands flat on the table and felt the specific, complicated sensation of something that had been in motion for 11 years finally reaching a point where momentum wasn't the dominant force anymore, where choices were available that hadn't been available before. She looked at Cartwright. "Who else?" she said. "On the committee. How many people know about me specifically?" Cartwright looked at his phone on the table, then at her. "4," he said, "including you." "Including me?" He paused. The careful nothing of his expression had finally shifted, not to guilt exactly, but to something that was done pretending to be neutral. "I was told you were a risk to the committee's continued operation. I was told containing you was a priority." "Containing." The language used was more specific, he said. "I chose not to implement it." She looked at him steadily. "Because of Solin's switch." "Because of the switch," he confirmed, "and because what I was told about you and what I observed in 48 hours of watching you operate are not the same person." The room was quiet except for Torres running the alternate channel connection. "You were going to let them close my file," she said. "I was considering my options," he said, which was an honest answer and not a comfortable one, and he seemed to know it. Grant came away from Cartwright's position and stopped beside Elena's chair. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, which was its own kind of statement. The secure line connected with the particular static burst of an encrypted channel, establishing. Falk sat down and pulled the phone toward him and looked around the room, at Cartwright, at Solon, at Grant, at Lena, with the expression of a careful man who had been handed a situation considerably above his pay grade and had decided that handling it precisely was the only available response. "This is going to take a while," he said. "I know," Elena said. She kept her hands flat on the table. She was still there when Rourke arrived 12 minutes later, and still there when Rourke confirmed what she already knew about the fibula, and still there when the sun came over the east ridge and filled the operations center windows with the pale flat light of a mountain morning. Whatever came next was going to come in daylight. That felt, for the first time in several hours, like something she could work with. The pale light held the operations center in something close to stillness, while Falk worked the secure line, and Elena sat with her hands flat on the table and listened to him talk to people above his pay grade in the careful, precise language of a man who understood that how you said a thing determined whether anyone believed you'd actually seen it. Rourke had wrapped her leg in a rigid field brace and given her 2 tablets that she pocketed without taking because she needed her head clear, and pain was something she could carry a little longer. The fibula would heal. Things healed. That was something she'd learned in the years since she stopped shooting people and started patching them. The body's fundamental insistence on repair, even when the mind was less certain about the project. Solon sat in the corner with a cup of coffee Torres had handed him without comment, which was the kind of small human gesture that Elena noted and filed as one of the reasons she trusted Torres more than most people she'd known for twice as long. Solon held the cup in his damaged hand and looked at the window where the morning light was coming in, and he had the quality of someone for whom the present moment was slightly unreal. Not in a dissociative way, but in the way of a man who had spent 3 years building toward a specific outcome and was now sitting inside it and hadn't quite calibrated to the fact that it had arrived. Cartwright hadn't moved from his chair. Grant stood near the door with his arms crossed, which was not a casual posture. It was the posture of a man who had placed himself between a particular person and a particular exit and was doing so deliberately. Falk said into the phone, "I need you to understand the scope of what I'm looking at. I have a serving intelligence officer whose communications contain operational direction inconsistent with his stated assignment. I have a third-party national with documented evidence against 4 individuals in the oversight chain, and I have a currently serving officer whose personnel file has been deliberately falsified at the classification level." He paused. "Yes, sir. I understand. I'll hold." He held. Elena looked at Cartwright. "The 3 other members of the committee," she said, "are they aware of where Solon is right now?" Cartwright considered whether to answer. He seemed to calculate that the gap between full cooperation and selective cooperation had narrowed to the point where the distinction was no longer worth protecting. "No, my last communication indicated the situation was unresolved." "Unresolved meaning I was still alive and Solon's location was unknown." "Yes. So they're waiting." "Yes." She looked at Grant. He understood the implication at the same moment she articulated it, She could see it in the small shift of his weight. Waiting meant they hadn't yet moved to the next action. Waiting meant there was still a window. "Falk," she said. Falk lowered the phone slightly. "Captain." "The committee doesn't know Solon is in this building. If they find out before SOCOM can move—" "I know," Falk said. He looked at Cartwright. "Is your communication with them automated or active?" "Active," Cartwright said. "They'll expect a status update in approximately 2 hours." "What happens if they don't get one?" Cartwright was quiet for a moment. "They'll assume the situation has become unmanageable. They'll activate a contingency." "What contingency?" Grant said. Another pause. Longer this time. The quality of Cartwright's pauses had shifted over the course of the night. The early ones had been calculated, managed, the deliberate silences of a man choosing his exposure. These later ones were different, more genuinely reluctant, which paradoxically made them more honest. "There's a secondary asset in the corridor," Cartwright said, "not affiliated with Solon's network. Someone the committee placed independently 6 weeks ago. Insurance." The room held that sentence. "Insurance against what?" Falk said. "Against this," Cartwright said. "Against exactly this outcome. If the primary operation failed to resolve the situation—" He stopped. He looked at Elena with the expression of a man who is going to say something he cannot unsay, and knows it. "The secondary asset's objective is Captain Cross." Grant uncrossed his arms. "Location," Elena said. "I don't know the exact position. I know the corridor. I know the asset was inserted by a different handler, and I was only told of its existence as a contingency briefing." He paused. "I was told not to need it." "Because you were supposed to manage the outcome before it came to that," she said. "Yes." She looked at the window. The morning light was full now, the mountain ridge visible against a sky that had cleared overnight, the kind of high-altitude clarity that came after storms and looked beautiful and meant that visibility conditions had become excellent in every direction. "Falk," she said. "How long for SOCOM to move on the committee members?" Falk spoke into the phone briefly, listened, and said, "Best case, 6 hours. The 3 stateside members require federal coordination. The 4th is overseas. That's a longer timeline." 6 hours, Grant said. He said it the way people said things they already knew were problems. "We have 2 hours before Cartwright's check-in window closes, and the committee activates the secondary asset," Elena said. "And we don't know where the asset is." "We know the corridor," Grant said. "The corridor is 4 kilometers wide, and we know how they think," Grant said. He looked at her steadily. "You know how they think. You know how this program operates because you operated in it. Where would they put a secondary asset in this corridor for this specific purpose?" She ran it. Not slowly. The way she ran everything, fast and thorough. The terrain map of the corridor overlaid with the operational logic of a program she'd spent 11 years trying to forget, and apparently hadn't forgotten at all. "High ground," she said, "south of the base. Not north. North is where the attention has been. North is compromised. South is the quiet direction. South is where someone goes when they want to be the variable nobody's accounting for." She paused. "There's a limestone shelf on the south ridge. 300 meters of elevation, clean line of sight to the base perimeter and the gate. Sheltered from the prevailing wind. It's where I would go." Silence. "How long to reach it?" Grant said. 40 minutes. Maybe 35 if we push the approach." He nodded once, looked at Falk. Falk looked at the phone in his hand, then at the window, then at the measured distance between where they were and where the decision was. "Go," Falk said. They went out the south gate at 0612 hours, Elena and Grant and Oakes, because Grant had looked at Oakes and Oakes had already been putting his kit on, and the conversation had consisted entirely of that. The south approach was different from the north. Less dramatic terrain, a longer, shallower climb through mixed vegetation and rock that in summer would have been almost pleasant, and in the current conditions was simply cold and exposed and required attention. Elena navigated without the thermal tool, by terrain memory and the specific low-light visual processing that years of working in the dark had either developed or revealed. She'd never been certain which. Her leg was loud about the first 100 meters. Then it settled into the background register of something she'd made a decision about and stopped renegotiating. Grant moved on her left. Oakes swept right, wider, covering the flank with the steady, professional patience that had made Elena revise her initial reading of him. She'd categorized Oakes early on as the friction element, the one most invested in her limitations, and she'd been right about that and wrong about what it meant. He wasn't hostile. He was protective of his people in the specific way of someone who had lost people before and intended not to again. She understood that better than she'd wanted to. At the 200-meter mark, Grant touched her arm once. "Stop." She stopped. He pointed. The limestone shelf was visible from below as a darker line against the paler rock face, and on it, barely distinguishable from the shadows thrown by the morning light, was the outline of a constructed position. Not a natural configuration. Rock stacked with intent. Someone was there. She looked at it for a long moment. She ran the angles. The position had a clean line of sight to the base gate, exactly as she'd projected. It also had two natural exit routes, both going north along the ridge, which told her something about how the asset had been inserted and how they expected to extract. She leaned close to Grant and kept her voice at the floor of audibility. Single position. One person, probably. The committee doesn't redundant resource secondary assets. It's a cost and exposure calculation. He nodded. "I need to go up alone," she said. He started to say something. "Not because I need to prove something," she said. "Because two people on that approach make noise one person doesn't. And if they hear us coming, they'll take a shot at the base gate before we reach them. One person quiet enough has a chance to get inside the position's dead ground before they know I'm there." He looked at the position. He looked at her. He did the math she'd already done, came to the same place she'd come to, and didn't like it any more than she did. "Oakes and I hold here," he said. "You take contact you can't handle, you break left down the slope, and we close." "Agreed." "Elena." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had several things to say and had made a decision about which ones were appropriate to this moment and this place. He settled on, "Come back down." It was not a tactical instruction. It was a simpler thing than that. "I will," she said. She went up. The approach to the limestone shelf took 19 minutes and covered ground that her fibula registered as an ongoing objection and that she moved across anyway, finding the seams in the rock face where the surface was stable and her foot placement could be silent, using the shadow thrown by the morning light to stay below the position's sightline for as long as the angle allowed. She came up on the position from the east, which required a lateral traverse that cost her 5 extra minutes, and repaid them by putting her approach entirely outside the asset's expected threat direction. The asset was a woman. Elena registered this in the first second of visual confirmation without making it mean anything, the way she registered all information, as data, not narrative. The woman was prone, her rifle extended toward the base gate 400 meters south, her attention divided between her scope and the approach routes she'd identified, and was monitoring with practiced peripheral awareness. She hadn't identified the east approach. Nobody ever did. Elena came over the lip of the shelf and said quietly, "Don't." The woman's body went rigid in the specific way of someone whose threat model has just failed completely. "Hands where I can see them," Elena said. Slowly. The woman released the rifle. She put her hands flat against the rock. She turned her head and looked at Elena with the expression of someone running an assessment, checking capability, checking angle, checking whether the math allowed a different choice. It didn't. "How old are you?" Elena said. The woman blinked. "What? How old?" A pause. 24. Elena crouched beside the position, keeping her line of sight on the woman's hands. She looked at the rifle. The configuration, the load, the range settings already dialed. She looked at the woman's kit, which was good equipment worn by someone who knew how to wear it. She looked at the woman's face, which was young and controlled and frightened in the specific way of someone who was frightened and working hard to not let that be the most visible thing about them. "Who trained you?" Elena said. The woman said nothing. "The program," Elena said. "How long have you been in it?" Still nothing. "I was in it for 11 years, Elena said. "I got out." She paused. "I'm going to tell you something that the people who run your program haven't told you yet, because they never tell you until the moment it's useful to them. The program closes files. That's what it does. Not just the files of the targets. The files of the assets." She held the woman's gaze. "You become a liability the moment you become inconvenient. I know this because they closed my file. Except I didn't die. And neither did the man I was sent to kill. And the documentation of why they closed both our files is currently being transmitted to military oversight while we're having this conversation. The woman was very still. The committee that runs your program is being rolled up today, Elena said. Which means whatever you were promised, whoever you report to, that structure is going away. And when it goes, the people in it will make choices about who they expose to limit their own exposure. She paused. You're 24. You're very good. And you're going to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder unless you walk away from this shelf right now and give me something I can use to make that possible. Silence. The morning wind moved across the shelf between them. I don't know the committee names, the woman said. I'm not asking for those. I have those. Elena looked at her steadily. I'm asking for your handler, the person who inserted you into this corridor, the person who gave you this target. A long pause. The woman closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had shifted in them. Not surrender exactly, but a recognition of the specific choice she was inside and what the actual cost of each option was. She gave Elena a name. Falk added the name to the information package at 0741 hours. The SOCOM liaison on the secure line confirmed receipt and indicated that the timeline for federal coordination on the stateside committee members had accelerated. The documentation from Solin's Dead Man transmission had begun releasing to its designated recipients at 700 hours, which included 2 oversight offices and a federal prosecutor's office, whose involvement Solin had arranged with the specific foresight of a man who had spent 3 years preparing for a contingency that most people would have stopped believing in after year 1. The 4th committee member, overseas, was a more complicated matter. Falk was told it was being handled through appropriate channels and to stand by for confirmation, which was the diplomatic way of saying that things were in motion that wouldn't be discussed on this line. By 0900 hours, 3 of the 4 committee members had been contacted by federal authorities. By 1100, the 4th had been located. Elena sat in the operations center through most of this, drinking coffee that Torres kept refilling without being asked, watching the machinery of consequence work through its steps with the impersonal efficiency of something that didn't care how long the underlying problem had been running, only that it had been given enough information to act. Cartwright had been formally detained at 0730 and remanded to military custody pending the federal coordination. He had not been resistant about it. In fact, at the moment Falk formally notified him of his status, he had said only, "I should have made different decisions earlier in this," and then stopped talking, and the sentence hung in the air with the particular weight of understatement that acknowledged everything without explaining anything. Elena had been in the room when he said it. She hadn't responded. She had nothing particularly useful to say to it, and useless things cost energy she was conserving for the decisions that were still in front of her. Solin left Whitmore at 1400 hours. Not under arrest, the legal and jurisdictional architecture around his status was complex enough that Falk's guidance from above was to hold him as a cooperative witness pending formal processing, which in practical terms meant that he was escorted to a transport by 2 personnel who were polite about it, and Solin was cooperative in return, because he had come here with the intention of burning down the structure that had used both of them, and the structure was currently burning, and that was, evidently, enough. Elena walked him to the transport. She didn't know why she did this. She thought about not doing it, and then found herself doing it anyway. Because the 11 years between the shot she'd made and this morning were not a simple story of victim and perpetrator, and she was honest enough with herself to know that. They stood at the transport for a moment before he boarded. "The program," she said, "the one you were rebuilding to dismantle, is it actually gone now?" He considered the question with the care it deserved. The infrastructure is. The people who funded it through the committee will face consequences that make rebuilding prohibitive. He paused. Whether the impulse that created it is gone, that's a different question. "It's not a question you can answer." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him. 11 years older than the photograph. The damaged hand. The careful economy of a man who had been running for a long time and had just stopped. "You could have come to me directly," she said, 6 months ago when you found out I was alive, instead of the glacier." "I know," he said. "I told myself the operational approach was necessary, that I needed to confirm your capabilities before I could—" He stopped. That wasn't entirely honest. What was the honest version? He looked at the mountain behind her. I wasn't sure you'd hear me out, given everything. He looked back. Given what I asked you to do for 11 years. Given what it cost you. She didn't tell him he'd been wrong to worry about that. She didn't tell him she'd forgiven anything, because she hadn't taken stock of that yet, and she wasn't going to manufacture a conclusion she hadn't actually reached. The dead man's switch, she said. Is it actually released now, or does it require something from you to confirm? He almost smiled. It's released. All 3 locations. Whether I'm alive to confirm or not, the information is already where it needs to be. He paused. I thought you might want to know that. She did want to know that. Get on the transport, she said. He got on the transport. Oched. The session with the SOCOM representatives happened at 1600 hours in the cipher-locked room and lasted 2.5 hours. There were 3 of them, a general officer and 2 individuals whose titles were described in terms that meant something specific to people inside a certain world and nothing at all to people outside it. They had the documentation. They had Cartwright's communications. They had the name Elena had brought off the limestone shelf. They had Solon's transmitted records, which were evidently more comprehensive than even Falk had anticipated, because 2 of the 3 representatives had expressions during the first 30 minutes of the session that people in that world were specifically trained not to show. Elena answered every question they asked her. She answered them the way she'd answered everything for the last 18 hours. Directly, without performance, without the strategic incompleteness that might have served a narrower interest. She was tired of strategic incompleteness. She had been living inside it for 6 years, and she was done with the weight of it. At the end of the session, the general officer looked at her across the table. Captain Cross, he said, your original program's activities and your role in them will be reviewed as part of this investigation. That process will take time. In the interim, he paused in the specific way of someone choosing a next sentence carefully. Your capabilities have been observed and documented over the past 48 hours by multiple witnesses. There are people above my level who believe those capabilities are currently underutilized. She looked at him. There is an interest, he said, in returning you to a more active role, given your demonstrated— No, she said. He stopped. I understand the interest, she said. I understand the argument. I've been hearing a version of it since I was 19 years old, and the argument has always been the same, that the skill justifies the use, that someone with this specific ability has an obligation to apply it in the way the institution finds most valuable. She paused. The answer is no. The answer has been no for 6 years, and the last 48 hours haven't changed it. The general officer looked at her with the careful expression of authority, encountering a refusal it hadn't fully anticipated. You'd remain a combat medic, he said. That isn't in question. Then what is in question? Your availability for situations requiring your full range of— My availability, she said, is to the people bleeding in front of me. That's the only commitment I've made that I intend to keep. She held his gaze. If you want a weapon, there are people who want to be weapons. I'm a medic. I was a weapon once for a long time, and I know the difference between those things in a way that this conversation seems to assume I've forgotten. The room held this. One of the other 2 representatives made a note, which was either a good sign or a bad one, and she found she didn't particularly care which. You're declining, the general officer said. I'm declining, she said, clearly and without ambiguity, so that it's in whatever record you're keeping. He nodded slowly. The nod of a man receiving information rather than processing defeat. Your medical clearance will need to— I'll work with Rourke on the fibula timeline, she said. When I'm cleared for full duty, I'll report to my unit. She paused. That's all I have. The session ended. Well, she found Grant at the north perimeter in the early evening, standing where she'd found him the first morning, looking at the same ridge systems against a sky that was doing something different now. The storm's aftermath had left a clarity that made the mountains look closer than they were. Every ridge and couloir sharp-edged and specific in the fading light. He heard her coming. He didn't turn around. There was something familiar about that already. SOCOM session, he said. Done. How'd it go? They wanted to put me back. What did you say? No. He turned then. He looked at her in the evening light with the expression she'd been cataloging across 48 hours. The one that had moved from suspicion to assessment, to something else that she didn't have a clean label for and wasn't sure she needed one. "You know there'll be another conversation," he said. "Another general officer, another argument. They won't stop asking." "I know, and you'll keep saying no." "Until I don't have to keep saying it," she said. Eventually, the answer becomes part of the record, and the record makes the question unnecessary. He was quiet for a moment. "What happens when the fibula clears?" "I go back to my unit," she said. "I go back to being a medic." She looked at the ridge. "I'm good at it. Not just the technical part. The part where you're the one person in the room whose job is to keep everyone else alive." She paused. "I like being that person. I didn't expect to like it as much as I do." "Because it's the opposite," he said. "Yes." "Of what you were." "Yes." She looked at him. "The program runs on the logic that extraordinary capabilities should be used the way the institution finds most efficient. And I understand that logic. It's not wrong exactly. But it treats the person as a delivery mechanism for the capability, and the capability is more important than what it costs the person to keep it sharp." She stopped. "I'm not willing to be that anymore. I haven't been for 6 years. The glacier didn't change that. It changed other things," Grant said. She looked at him. "Oakes apologized to you this morning," he said. "You didn't hear him because you were in with Rourke. He stopped by the medical bay and told the duty nurse to tell you he'd been wrong about you from the start, and he was sorry for how he'd treated you on the approach." She hadn't known that. "Calvin has been telling every person at this base what you did on the saddle," Grant continued. "Not the shot on the ridge. The rock. He thinks the rock is the best thing he's ever seen anyone do under pressure. He used the word genius 3 times. She almost smiled. "Akita told me," Grant said, and I'm quoting directly here, "that he's been on 31 operations in 14 years, and he's never seen anyone move the way you move. And Akita does not compliment people. I've worked with him for 4 years, and I think I've received 2 compliments." She looked at the ridge and was quiet for a moment. "I didn't do any of it to be seen," she said. "I know," Grant said. "That's why they're talking about it." The light was going off the mountains now, the clarity deepening into the specific blue of high-altitude dusk. Somewhere below the ridge, the base was moving through its evening cycle. The dining facility, the perimeter check, the quiet mechanical continuation of a place that had been through something difficult and was still functioning. "I want to ask you something," Elena said. "Okay." "The second morning, in the corridor, you told Oakes you'd been wrong about me twice, the angle and the tripwire." She looked at him. "When did you actually stop being wrong about me?" He thought about this with the genuine consideration he gave things that deserved it. "Somewhere between the rock-faced traverse and the rifle assembly," he said. "I stopped being wrong about what you were. It took me longer to stop being wrong about what that meant." "What does it mean?" He looked at her steadily. "That the most capable person on that glacier spent 2 days keeping 8 other people alive and asked for nothing in return, and almost nobody noticed until it was impossible not to." He paused. "That's not a small thing." She held his gaze for a moment. "Come back," she said. He frowned slightly. "From where?" "When you're done with this assessment cycle, when you're back at your unit." She paused. "There's a training program at Bragg that's been trying to integrate medical and tactical instruction. Real integration. Not a 1-week block in the curriculum, but something structural. They've been looking for people who understand both sides." She paused again. "I've been thinking about it for a year. I could use someone who knows how to ask the right question at the right moment." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're asking me to help you teach," he said. "I'm asking you to think about it." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration. The face of a man inserting a possibility into his picture of the future that hadn't been there before. "I'll think about it," he said. She nodded. She turned and walked back toward the base, her boot crunching on the frozen ground, her leg registering its steady complaint that she continued to ignore, the cold coming off the mountain in the long, slow exhale of a day ending. Behind her, Grant watched her go. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Ook. 3 weeks later, Elena Cross returned to her unit on a medical clearance that Rourke had signed with the notation fitness for full duty pending physiotherapy compliance, and an eyebrow raised in the specific way of a physician who knows the patient has been ignoring the compliance requirement and intends to keep doing so. The fibula healed. The committee's 4 members faced federal charges of varying severity. 2 accepted arrangements, 1 contested and lost. The 4th, overseas, was processed through a mechanism that didn't produce public documentation and resulted in an outcome that Elena was informed of briefly and chose not to think about at length. Cartwright served 8 months and was quietly released into a life that was smaller and less positioned than the one he'd had, which Elena considered an appropriate consequence and not a satisfying one, because satisfying consequences required a clarity about justice that reality rarely delivered in the exact shape you wanted. Solon disappeared into the federal witness architecture and emerged 2 years later as a consultant with a different name in a program she heard about secondhand and chose not to investigate. She had said what she'd needed to say to him at the transport, and the conversation was complete, and that was sufficient. The secondary asset, the woman on the limestone shelf, cooperated fully with the investigation. She was 24 years old and had been in the program for 3 years and had been told things about herself and her role that were specifically calibrated to make leaving feel impossible. Elena wrote a letter on her behalf to the federal prosecutor's office. She didn't hear back about whether it made a difference. She sent it anyway. Calvin Osei visited Bragg the following spring. He brought a bottle of something expensive and stayed for 4 days and spent most of them at the training program, watching Elena and Grant run a combined medical tactical instruction block for a mixed group of operators and medics who were mostly skeptical about integration and left mostly convinced. Not entirely. That was fine. Entirely convinced was for people who hadn't seen enough yet. On the last day, Calvin sat in the back of the training room and watched Elena talk through a casualty scenario with a group of 8 operators, former shooters, competent and professional, and initially resistant to being instructed by someone who walked with a slight asymmetry that they weren't too polished to notice. And he watched the room change over 90 minutes the way rooms changed when someone knew what they were doing and couldn't be budged from it by skepticism or hierarchy, or the particular social pressure of a room full of people who expected to know more than you. She wasn't performing for them. She was just right, and she knew she was right, and she kept being right until the room caught up. He thought about the glacier, the 41 minutes she'd been on the ridge, the penlight signal through the blizzard. He thought about how nobody had known what she was. He thought about how she had known exactly, the whole time, and had chosen anyway, to patch the wound before making the shot, to come back down the ridge instead of staying on it, to say no to the general officer with the same flat calm she'd used to tell him she was fine when she had a fractured bone and was 19 minutes from the wire. He wrote about it later in a way he never shared with anyone. He wrote it because some things needed to be put into words before you could be certain you'd actually understood them. He wrote, "She was never protecting a secret. She was protecting a choice. The secret was just the price of keeping it." But in the operations room at Bragg, late on a Thursday, when the training block had finished, and the participants had cleared out and the room had settled into the quiet of institutional spaces after hours, Elena Cross sat at the table where the casualty scenarios had been laid out and looked at nothing in particular. Grant came in with 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat across from her, and they were quiet together for a while the way people are quiet when they've been working in the same direction for long enough that silence is a comfortable register rather than a gap. The coffee was bad. It was always bad at Bragg. She drank it anyway. "Good session," Grant said. "The second group is still resistant to the integration model," she said. "The senior NCO thinks medical instruction belongs in a separate block. He'll come around?" "Probably not," she said, "but the people learning from him might." Grant looked at his coffee cup. "That's a long game." "Everything worth doing is a long game," she said. And she meant it the way she meant most things, without decoration, as a simple statement of what she'd found to be true. She thought about the glacier, about the moment she'd opened the compartment in the ruck, the way the room had gone quiet, the way Grant had looked at her and started asking a different kind of question. She thought about 6 years of building a life that was entirely hers, and the 48 hours that had tried to take it apart, and the fact that it had held, not perfectly, nothing held perfectly, but it had held in the ways that mattered. She was still a medic. She was still the person whose job was to keep everyone else alive. Nobody had taken that from her. She had not let them. She drank her bad coffee and sat across from a man she trusted in a room where tomorrow there would be more people to teach. And outside the window, the evening was doing what evenings did, moving through its colors toward dark. And somewhere in the mountains, a glacier was still standing in all that cold. and she was here. And that was the thing she had chosen. And choosing it again every day was how you made it true. The ones who protect without being asked, who carry what others can't see, who stay when walking away would be easier. They are not always the ones standing at the front. Sometimes they are standing quietly beside you, keeping you alive, asking for nothing. That is not weakness. That is the rarest kind of strength there is.